All right, welcome everyone. If you're watching this video, it means that you've signed up to be a member on my channel here. You're helping support the community that I build. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully, I think this video is going to be my first big way of saying thank you. Especially if you're somebody who's watching this initially when the video comes out, it means that you've signed up to be a member very early in my journey. You've been supporting me really from the beginning. I've got some videos out there, but this is the first big members only video. I've actually been planning this video out for about a month. A lot of work went into the material, the methodology, the slide deck, everything that we're going to show you. You've seen this in my recent live streams. I've been showing some of the process here, but now we're going to do a deep dive into the process. I'm going to make sure that you have all the tools you need to go and start building this muscle using this process as part of your bug bounty methodology. So let's go ahead and bring the slides in here. Don't want to waste a lot of time talking up front and go ahead and get into it. Today, we're going to be talking about threat modeling. Specifically, we're going to do stride threat modeling. So the reason that I wanted to focus on this is by far the most common question that I've got from people all over the world, and really at a lot of different levels of bug bounty hunting. I've been getting this question from people that have found some level of success, that have several valid bugs and everything, but they want to know, how do you move from finishing up your recon process? So you've got a lot of information about what targets are out there. How do you move to doing manual testing and have that be fruitful? Right? It's obviously you can go out and just start kind of throwing things out there, but how do you avoid just running active scan on everything, or just drifting around and kind of poking around and seeing, just testing random vulnerabilities? Which, look, you can find bugs that way, but you're not going to get a huge return on investment for the amount of time that you're spending. So how do you look at an application? How do you look at the results of your recon process and map that to a list of manual tests that you can conduct, that you are confident if something goes wrong in their security controls, this is going to be a valid attack? Whereas if you're just drifting around and testing random things, right, you may say, okay, does this CORS implementation work? Does this work? Is this input reflected? Nothing's actually mapping back to a specific attack. So you may go through and find that. You may find things where you're popping an alert, or you find a misconfigured CORS endpoint, or a CSRF mechanism that doesn't work, and all these different things. But by the time you go and actually start mapping out a real attack, there's no way to actually weaponize it. There's no way to show impact. And that's where you end up getting these not applicable findings, or things where you get in debates with the people who are triaging it and everything. So this methodology, using threat modeling as part of your process, is going to help make sure that you know that all the tests that you're conducting and everything that you're working towards, the time that you're investing in going through and testing these different attacks, you've already identified that each of these attacks is possible. And you have a very clear attack strategy. And now you're just going through and you're spending your time testing to see whether or not the developers and the company itself have implemented the security controls in the correct way. And then once you find a failure in those security controls, you can say, oh, that access control check is not working, or that, they're accepting this OAuth, token where they shouldn't be using it, or the scope is not right, or this CSRF token doesn't work, or this course, right? It all leads back to this initial attack plan that you have. And you can see, okay, this specific security control failed. Now I know that this attack path is possible, and you can start building that out, and that will eventually become your report, right? The bug that you submit. So you've got the title screen here, right? We're looking at threat modeling for bug bounty hunting. This is a process methodology for moving from recon to manual testing. And it says threat modeling is a disciplined way to stop drifting between random tests, and instead you're going to focus your time on attacks that have a real chance of succeeding based on how the system actually works, right? So let's go ahead and move on. It would help if I clicked on the thing there. That always happens. All right, so let's talk about what threat modeling is to begin. And again, it's a very well-established process. threat modeling is something that if you ever worked on a blue team or worked on an application security team, this is a core part of our process. And again, that's where I really come from the blue team side. When a company and when the developers and the product team within that company start to build a new mechanism within an application or a new component of an application or a whole new application itself, and they go through and they have the architecture and there's a general idea of what the application is going to do, how it's going to work, etc., then the developers and the product team and everybody involved on that engineering side are going to sit down with the application security team and probably the operations, right? Anybody who's in charge of the cloud infrastructure, all that. And they're going to go through this threat modeling process. And what we are doing here is we're recreating that process, but as an attacker. We're gonna do the same thing where we go through our recon, we identify the information that we need, just like the blue team would have, it would be provided by the engineers, and then we're going to sit there and go through a systematic way to say, how would an attacker approach this? What can an attacker actually do and what can they not do? And then all of that is going to be mapped to an actual testing plan, right? A threat profile, which will map to a testing plan that we can use to go through and say, okay, because of this technology, and we know that this is possible because this mechanism does this and it's accessing this object and we have these security controls, we know that if these things fail, then we're going to have a viable attack path. So that's the process of threat modeling here. It says threat model is the bridge between passive recon and intentional manual testing. It helps you stop guessing and start testing with a purpose, right? It's a disciplined way to stop drifting between random tests and instead focus your time on attacks that have a real chance of succeeding based on how the system actually works, right? And it's I have a couple different bullet points here just to identify it, right? You want to eliminate that random testing. And I see this all the time, right? And again, I see it at different levels, right? You get through the recon and then people just start throwing active scans at different places. They have techniques and things that they found that have worked before, and so they'll just take that and move it over and throw it at a different application. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to take a step back. We're going to understand the application, understand what's really possible, and then we're going to use that information to build an attack plan out of all the possible attacks that would be possible. And this is something where I always talk about, learning each one of the attacks is like putting a tool in your tool belt. So at this point, the more tools that you have in your tool belt, the more opportunities you're going to be able to identify, the more real world attacks that you're going to be able to map to this threat profile. And as I go through this slide deck and the methodology, I'm going to be identifying where AI can come into play as well. Because, and remember, it's AI is more about, it's almost like a rubber duck, right? Don't rely on everything that it says, take everything with a grain of salt, but it can be a great way to help you, especially in the beginning, start to map the information that you're gathering to specific threats and then mapping those threats to specific attacks. Because this is a muscle that you're going to develop over time. It's not something that you can just sit here and learn and do overnight and you're going to be an expert. This is something, I've been doing this for close to 15 years now, and it's something that becomes a core part of the value that a company gets when they hire on an experienced security engineer, an experienced application security, product security practitioner, anything like that, right? They have gone through this process so many times with so many different applications and so many different use cases. They've identified what vulnerabilities can come from the different functionality and the different mechanisms. And they've also seen where they've missed things in the past that have ultimately led to vulnerabilities later that have gotten into production. So all of this, again, going back, it's a muscle. It's something that you have to exercise, something that you have to do. The more cycles that you get, the better you're going to be at it. And if you're just starting out, that's where AI can help kind of guide you and point you in the right direction, as well as our Discord community, right? So go on there and either in the public channels, or if you want to keep it a little tighter, in the supporter and the partner channels in there, and discuss it, and kind of feel free to get some advice from other people, and other people may have seen other things but yeah, anyway, it is a process. It's a muscle that you will need to build over time, right? So ultimately, threat modeling, the goal is to ensure that every test you run is informed by how the system could realistically fail. It's not informed by habit, right? Again, those things that you've just done on other applications. So let's just go try it here. It's not by hope. That's your active scan, right? Like active scan. I'm gonna walk away. I'm gonna sit there and hopefully I'll come back with a valid finding that Burp Suite found. And then what happens? You submit it and it's a duplicate. It's probably been submitted by 100 other people because everybody has Burp Pro and everybody's doing the exact same thing. Or copy and paste techniques, same type of thing, right? I saw this worked over here. It worked, will it work here? And you're not even thinking about, does the technology stack work in the same way? Do the mechanisms work in the same way? All that type of stuff. So, and it's, there's going to be a lot of questions that you're going to ask yourself. I've got a couple examples down here at the bottom. What does this system assume that I can't do? What did the developers assume that I can't do? With like access controls, did they just make the assumption, or even just navigating? Yeah, let's say like navigating to an admin settings page. Let's say you can go to, admin settings. And if you're an admin level in the role, then you click on that button. There's going to be a button showed in the UI. You click on that, it's going to navigate you directly to that. Well, did the developers, did they just assume that if you don't see that button, you're not going to know that that endpoint exists? Right? That's an assumption that the system that the developers are making that we as attackers can test. This is all about putting yourself in the attacker mindset. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to identify the system, the mechanisms, the trust boundaries, and the assumptions that the system makes about those mechanisms, the objects we're going to target, the security controls that are going to affect it. All of that is going to map into a specific threat profile, and then we will take those and identify with that threat profile what actual test we can go through and try, right? Or what's worth our time? Where are we going to get a return on investment? Another one is the server trusting something it shouldn't? That's very common insecure direct object references, IDOR. Is the ID value that is being used to identify the larger data set that's being pulled from the database, is that included in a client-side parameter that the backend implicitly trusts? Because obviously it shouldn't be. It should be checking to see whether or not that user is authorized to access that data. So that's just another example. And then a big one that I always want you to think about when you're conducting threat modeling: what parts of the application were built for convenience instead of security, right? Where did the developers in the company run into a situation where they needed to build onto an existing system like authentication, for example, very quickly because they had to get a new piece of the application out because they had a customer, a new big customer? It's going to result in 25% of their annual revenue, and this customer has to have this special SSO or the special authentication built out. And so the developers had to scramble to go and do it, and they had to rush it out, and it didn't get enough testing. That's the type of stuff where you can find vulnerabilities, where they're kind of rigging the existing system to do these additional use cases, right? So if you can go in and identify, and a lot of this has to do with complexity, is there one part of the authentication that was, this additional OAuth use case that was clearly built out to make it convenient for a single customer? That's something that we're going to be looking at and we can target as well. So that's threat modeling in general. And again, we're going to be focusing on stride threat modeling. We'll dig into what stride means, a lot more in a bit, but it's every letter in stride stands for a different word or category, and you'll go through all 6 of those to identify, potential threats that could be on those mechanisms. So, this is basically the when or the where of the question, right? What is the starting point? When do you use threat modeling? When do you not use threat modeling? So at this point, reconnaissance is complete. You've started with the company, and if you use my framework, this is probably going to be very evident within the process as well, right? You've started with the company name. You've identified any ASNs and network ranges and IP addresses that might be associated with any on-prem infrastructure that they have. You've enumerated their DNS records, including any subdomains that are going to be within scope. And ultimately, you've landed on a list of in-scope URLs that are pointing to direct live web applications. So now you're moving into which one of these applications do I go in and test, and more importantly, how do I test those, right? You have a high-level understanding of what the overall application in the company does and what the core functionality is, right? So now you're going to go through the process. You're essentially going to go through the next steps we're going to talk about to prepare for the actual stride threat model, getting a deeper understanding about the application, its architecture, its functionality, all that stuff. And then we will later use that to go through the stride, STRIDE, right? So the challenge right now at this phase of your methodology, your process, it's not discovering more assets. You do have a group of assets, so you need to determine what assets are worth, or what attacks are worth testing on those assets. That's where the threat modeling comes in. So you see a quick little summary at the bottom there, right? Full recon methodology is complete. Now, of course, you're always going to, it's always an ebb and flow. You always hear me talk about an ebb and flow. So when you're going to, once you've got a good number of targets and you've got some specific targets that you want to dig into, then you'll go in and do some threat modeling and tests, but you'll probably run into a point where you hit a wall there. There's nothing else to milk out of those applications. Then you take a step back and keep doing recon, keep doing enumeration, building out the attack surfaces. Maybe you can find new mechanisms, you can find new functionality, new target applications, and then you'll move back in to the threat modeling, right? So this threat modeling process is that link between your recon and your actual manual testing. And I've said this multiple times in the live streams, but I'll keep saying this again. Threat modeling costs you time up front, but it's going to save you a lot of wasted time, a lot more wasted time in the back end when you're doing your testing, right? And bug bounty hunting is all about getting return on investment for your time, because bug bounty hunters are only paid for results. You're not paid for your effort, at least not in typical bug bounty hunting, right? And again, that's, there's other ways, other processes with that. But that's what creates the win-win scenario with bug bounties. And so you as a bug bounty hunter, you have to understand that reality. And then you have to kind of play within that. You have to find a way to put that return on investment, put that luck on your side right there. So again, full recon methodology is complete, although you will continue to come back and forth. It's always an ebb and flow throughout this entire methodology. You have a target URL that's selected, so we're going to dig into one application. You say, this looks like one that's going to be worth my time. We've got the return on investment report that came back from my framework. I've seen all these different things, the technology stack, the SSL implementations, there's enough information there to tell me that it's going to be worth my time. And then the application itself as well, it needs to be, you want to have manually crawled the application and get an idea of the core functionality just to see, like, is there enough mechanisms? Is there enough here to go through and threat model, right? But you're also going to be doing that as part of the next process that we're going to look at here. All right. So I said the first thing that we're going to do, we're looking at an application, we're looking at a target URL, is we need to identify the application's purpose, the problems it solves, right? All that it solves, and then the architecture itself, the technology stack, everything. We're just looking to get a high level understanding. We're going to continue to dig in deeper and deeper. But what's really, really important here is understanding the purpose, understanding who the users are going to be, because those users are going to be who we're targeting with all of the threats, right? Is it an internal application that's only being used by people within a company? Is it being used by any individual? Is it how are the different tenants and trust boundaries separated, et cetera? And we'll dig into that more after this. But so it says, before threat modeling can begin, you need a clear understanding of the application's architecture and purpose. This stage involves systematically answering a structured set of questions for each application to understand what problems it's designed to solve, who it serves, and how the core functionality works at a high level, right? You've seen me especially do this in my latest live streams where we're going in my framework. We've got a long list of different questions that are, just, who are the user? What's the purpose? How is authentication handled? How is session established? Is it hosted in the cloud? Is it hosted on it, right? All these different things that are going to inform the downstream processes as we narrow deeper and deeper into specific target mechanisms and determining whether or not we can actually exploit them. You're identifying the major components, technologies, and this is really important here too, and external services, right? What integrations does it have? What other domains is it allowed to talk to? What is it pulling in from other places? All that stuff. That make the application function without diving into individual vulnerabilities. We're not even thinking about vulnerabilities yet, aside from just some general, like what's possible and what's not. If the application doesn't have the ability to allow you to upload a file anywhere, then that a file upload is not going to be possible. If it has the ability to upload, or file upload vulnerability, right? If it has the ability to upload files, however, it's using a specific cloud mechanism like AWS pre-signed URLs, and it's staging them on S3 buckets, then now later that trying to do the type of file upload vulnerabilities that would attack different directories within the within the server. If it was all stored on a single server, that's not going to be possible. So that's what we're looking to get, that base of information that as we dig deeper, we can keep referring back to this, and it's going to tell us what's possible, what's not, and eventually point us in the direction of the attack processes that are worth our time. So the goal of this phase is to build enough context to reason about risk and failure later. Not looking to exploit anything at this stage, but to ensure your testing decisions are informed and intentional. And I've got a couple different things like steps listed down there at the bottom right. Identify the core workflows and user roles, right? How, are there different levels of roles? What are the main workflows based on the purpose of the application that the users are going to use? How does the login mechanism work? What are the different authentication processes? All that stuff. But yeah, user roles, how the application identifies the client is another big one, right? That's how we get into IDORs. Just the general functionality. Then you're going to map all the major application components, so if it's a tool and, one piece of the application is designed to support, all of the HR department, right? And this is, where they can handle those. That's split up into, maybe one part of that is payroll and the other part of that is, handling reward system or like a feedback system, et cetera. Those are all going to be your major components. This is another thing that you'll kind of get a feel for over time. But as throughout this whole process, don't be too strict on yourself. There's no right answers or wrong answers really until you get to the very end. But it's really about forcing yourself to ask the right questions, go in and identify and stuff, and you'll build up that muscle over time. Identifying the, really web applications, most of them can be broken down into like probably a list of like 200 or 300 different types of components that are designed to solve problems. So as you see a lot of different types of applications over time and you test a lot of different ones, you'll start to map those out in your head. It'll be easier to divide them up into their components, right? Then you want to enumerate the technologies and the dependencies, right? It's really important that we understand how this is running. The back-end and front-end code that's used is going to have a big effect on what's possible from an attacker perspective, whether it's hosted in the cloud or whether it's what type of cloud it's hosted, right? An application that's hosted in Azure and an application that's hosted in AWS, there may be completely different ways that we could approach attacking those. Go back to the file upload example that I had just a minute ago. A file upload that's handled with AWS services, the attack profile is completely different from a file upload that's handled through Azure or GCP, just depending on how they do that. So you need to understand that. You need to understand the dependencies, the third-party code that's written within the application. Like I mentioned before, what third-party services are being used as part of the larger application, right? Most applications nowadays are, a string of distributed microservices in the cloud, and a lot of them are pinging off a bunch of third-party services. All of those are different things that we can use or we can target as part of our threat model. That's the last one at the end there, right? External services and integrations, very, very important. Understand how the integration is handled and established, right? Is it an OAuth integration? Is it some type of custom thing that they're doing? Are they storing an API key, on the back end, and then there's some way that you can retrieve it, right? All of these will inform how we can potentially try to target these mechanisms. And that kind of leads on to the next one here. Once you have that high level understanding of the application itself, the next thing that you're going to want to do is identify the mechanisms and the trust boundaries that are established for that mechanism. And we'll talk about, I've got some examples there, we'll talk about what that means, but the trust boundary side itself is very, very important, right? So once the application's purpose and architecture are understood, the next step is to enumerate the mechanisms that it relies on, right? Things like authentication, any tokens that are used to, either identify the client or handle authentication authorization as well. What APIs exist, what background or what jobs are running on the background and the back end. What does the CI/CD pipeline look like? What integrations, all of those things. We want to identify the individual mechanisms because these mechanisms are how you're going to target, or these are what you're going to target with your threat model. And again, it says from there to identify where trust is placed between the components, setting the stage for understanding how these assumptions could be violated during an attack. So I have some examples over here, and being able to not just identify the mechanism, but be able to understand the trust boundary is, again, another thing that you will build up over time. This is something else where potentially AI can help. Take it with a grain of salt, right? Make sure you're, especially like AI will always push you in the direction of something being like a critical vulnerability or anything. So always kind of don't let it evaluate the criticality of something. But if you were to explain it, hey, here's this specific mechanism and here's how it works. Can you help me identify the trust boundaries and ask a couple questions? It's going to help you get there. And then over time, you'll see the different ways, because every mechanism, typically there's only a few different ways that you could implement it with different trust boundaries where it still makes sense. And then each one of those implementation types is going to have places where those trust boundaries can fail. But it's the trust boundaries themselves, that's what we're testing. So if we look on the right-hand side here, right, I've got 4 different examples of mechanisms that we would identify and target as part of a threat model. These are very common ones. And then the trust boundaries that will commonly be associated with it. So first, looking at a login flow. A login flow, it's trusting that either the credentials that are provided, so if it's a username, password, login, or the tokens that are provided, so that would probably be like an OAuth implementation. You give it a refresh token, it'll return an access token, or maybe there's a mechanism that exchanges an OAuth access token for a session token in a cookie, and it's doing it there. But ultimately, that login flow, so you provide it credentials or you go through the OAuth process and have an access token that's given, the backend server trusts that those credentials or tokens are provided by the user that owns them, and it establishes an authentication session. So that is the trust boundary. The backend trusts that if you have the credentials or if you have an access token, OAuth access token or whatever it may be, SAML, whatever, if you have that token, then I trust that you are a legitimate user, you are who you claim to be, and I'm going to give you an authenticated session token that you can use to continue to interact with the application as this user. So that's the trust boundary that you can target. Well, how do you target that? Well, you're going to have to get access to, well, potentially get access to either those credentials or the access tokens. And so the access token, in my mind, it's fairly difficult to get access to the credentials. Maybe you can do a SQL injection or something else. But if you're looking at an OAuth implementation and there's multiple different places within the application to get a refresh token or an access token, and that can be exchanged. Maybe the OAuth process itself can be poisoned or manipulated. We can change the redirect URI so that it can send it to an evil server we trust. Now we've got an access token. It doesn't use a state token, and so we can use basically a CSRF attack to have them authenticate from somewhere else without their knowledge, and then we would steal the access token that way. But if we can steal an access token, a refresh token, credentials, something involved with the SAML process that will allow us to impersonate that user, then we would have attacked the login flow and we would have bypassed that trust boundary, because the login flow, it implicitly trusts that only the valid user is going to have that value, right? Next one is a change password mechanism. So the change password mechanism, it says it trusts that the current session or a re-authentication step is legitimate, and it authorizes the action to occur, right? So if we have that valid session token, that valid session cookie, and an HTTP request goes to that endpoint and says, I want to change the password to this, and it says, okay, well, this token is legitimate, then it's going to allow you to make that modification. If it's a re-authentication step, right, that's going to be an additional, that's typically where it would ask for another password as well, right, the existing password, and then it would go and say, okay, well, let's authenticate first, just like through the login flow, right, that's an extra layer of security. So you need to understand what the backend endpoint is implicitly trusting so that we can, as the attacker, exploit that trust and try to get something to happen that shouldn't happen, right? So if it doesn't have that reauthorization step and it just implicitly trusts the session token, then we know that we have the opportunity, if we can get, typically it's going to be a combination of cores, CSRF, and some type of client-side injection. And the way that the security controls, which we'll get to later, implemented would decide what makes that possible, right? So again, understanding how the backend endpoint establishes trust before it makes that password change is going to help inform the attacks that we'll later be building to execute. For an account recovery or a reset flow, right? You've lost your password or anything. This right here, now the user is not expected to be able to have a legitimate session token. So the trust boundary is different here. The trust boundary is a bit more open than it would typically be. So here we have it, trust that an email or token-based verification will grant that account access. How this typically works is you'll go through reset password, you'll put your email address in there, it will send an email with a link to you, and when you click on that, the URL within that link includes a token that will be processed on the back end, validated, and then that's how the back end establishes that trust. Say, okay, they have this ID value, so we trust that this individual is who they say they are, because the only person who should have this ID is somebody with the link, which means they have access to their email. And so we'll go ahead and continue the reset flow, reset the password, do whatever. So now as attackers, we're not targeting a session, we're targeting that access token. How do we get access to that? Well, can we get the system to send us an email for another user? Then we can potentially go and do this reset. I mean, that's it, right? That's the whole game right there. Can we find a way to guess the values in the token after we have another user reset their password? Can we force them to reset their password, right? All of these. So the trust boundary is totally different. We're not even thinking about leveraging someone's session anymore to do that, because it doesn't make any sense to leverage the session. We're attacking the trust boundary where the back end implicitly trusts this token that's included within the link that's sent in an email. And then the last one that I've listed on here is role or settings update functionality that trusts a client-supplied input to enforce permission checks, right? So is there a value? The most common way that I see this is you have a JSON web token that's your session token, essentially. And within that JSON web token, in the body, the payload, you have the user's role. So the user's role is now trusted through client-side input, as opposed to they would validate the session and then identify the user's role from the back-end database. If it was taken from the back-end database, then there is no trust boundary there. There is no trust between the back-end and the client when it comes to the role. But here in this example, the back-end does implicitly trust the value that is given from the client side. Now we just need to find a way to trick that back end into believing that we have a different value. So with the example that I had with the JSON web token, there would need to be a failure to validate the signature. So are they actually validating it correctly? Can we put in a none algorithm, get rid of the signature and change whatever we want? If they're using HS256, is there a way that we can guess what that password would be, right? Are they signing it with their public key or something, wild like that? How are they validating the identity of the client? And if we can find a way to find a way where that the validation of the JSON web token specifically breaks, then because they're implicitly trusting the role that's listed within that JSON web token, we would be able to manipulate the backend into giving us, higher level privileges than we would typically have, right? So, and remember, these mechanisms, these are what we're going to be specifically targeting when we're going through our Stride threat model and talking about how we would attack it. So it's really important that you get a good list of specific mechanisms that you also know, if they fail, would give you value as a bug bounty hunter, right? If the mechanism is to read marketing information that's already public, who cares about that mechanism? That shouldn't be listed on your on your page. That shouldn't be listed in your threat model at all. Whereas if there's a way to kind of manipulate that read to become an update or a delete or even a create where you can create new information. Now all of a sudden there's some additional opportunities from there as an attacker. So you're always, the mechanisms that you're identifying, you want to go to the mechanisms that are going to have the greatest impact from a security perspective. And that's where you see I have like login, change password, account recovery, determining what the user is authorized to do based on the role. These are all mechanisms that are very commonly used, are very commonly targeted by bug bounty hunters, right? I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anybody. So once you have the mechanisms identified, you're also going to want to spend some time identifying the notable objects. And this is, the mechanisms themselves, I mean, they are very technical and specific, right? You have an endpoint and you have a flow of HTTP requests and responses that ultimately makes up the mechanism that you're targeting. But these, the objects themselves, these are really specific. These are either objects that are stored on the back end or on the front end, and it's typically a combination of the two. A lot of times you have a subsection of the larger object that's stored on the front end, and then the back end would have the whole thing, right? So if you're looking at a user object, maybe on the client side, the user object has things like, username, role, user ID, a couple other values that are in there that the front end needs to use. And then the back end has the full user object, which is going to include things like your password hash and your, some metadata and Boolean value, signed up, does it have this feature flag, etc. So identifying these objects, these are what you're going to be targeting with your attacks. So it's really important that you know what objects exist and you do your best to identify any key value pairs or any data that's stored within that object, because ultimately these are going to be the targets of your attack, right? If you're targeting the password reset mechanism, then the password there is what's going to determine. That's what you're ultimately going to be modified. But there may be other values within that user object that affect how that password reset mechanism works. So let's say in the sign up process, you first create a user account with an email, and then it sends you an email. You click on that link, it comes back, and then once that email is validated, then you get the option to enter a password. This is a fairly common mechanism. Some of you might have seen a couple times. That means if that exists, there must be some type of Boolean value or some type of value within the user object or tied to the user object that informs the backend about whether or not that email has been validated, and then ultimately determines whether or not that user is prompted to enter their password. So can we, as an attacker, could we make a modification? Maybe we can't directly inject, or we can't directly change the password with the logic of the application, but maybe there's another area where we can change that Boolean value. Maybe it's a value that says, email validated, and it starts as false. And every time you load it up as false on a certain endpoint, it'll say you need to validate your email again. And then once it's true, then it will go through and do an additional process. Well, can we change this back to false and reset that, and then find a way from there, reset that whole mechanism, and then find a way from there to, maybe trigger a new email that we could steal, or ultimately be able to come in and enter a new password, right? It all depends on the application logic, but understanding as much as you can about these objects that are used within the application is going to tell you what's possible. And a lot of times you've got to try to leak these additional things there, but you want to make sure that you're documenting those and understand what objects are involved in the attacks that you're building, so that you know what's possible and what's not possible. And it gets very specific, as opposed to this ephemeral, we'll try to steal the cookie this way, or we'll try to, just change the value in this way. No, you need to have a really clear vision in your head, a really clear attack plan about I'm targeting these objects with these mechanisms to try to get these key value pairs, these data points to change from this to this, and ultimately it's going to have that downstream effect. right? So I've got a few examples up here. The user object that we already talked about, you can target it for account takeover and impersonation. I think that's fairly simple. Sensitive data objects are very common. These are the ones that if you're looking to get an IDOR, you're looking to change or modify, you're looking to leak sensitive data. These are the ones that you're going to be targeting. So you want to make sure to get those. Any authentication artifacts, a lot of times a user token will, there'll be a user object and there'll also be like a session object that maybe has some information about the session when it was established, and it's going to be linked over to that user object. OAuth tokens, right? API keys, grants, all those types of things. Anything that is involved with the authentication process. And a lot of times you're going to have to take these from request responses and try to infer as much as possible. A lot of times these aren't leaked as much to the front end, but this also shows the more information that the back end releases to the front end, the more that you're going to have to play with and be able to identify as the bug bounty hunter. And then, transaction objects, another example, right? When you go through your payment card information, when you actually make a payment, your transactions, your invoices, all that stuff. Again, that just goes back to sensitive data that we can potentially leak here, right? And just down at the bottom, I want to read here, defining these objects up front gives the threat model clear targets and keeps testing focused on outcomes that matter, right? You're not drifting, you're not guessing, you're not hoping, you're not saying, oh, I heard about this, we're doing this. No, you're looking at what's possible based on the mechanisms and the objects, and then you are building an attack plan that encompasses what is actually possible within the scope of this application. So once you've got the mechanisms, once you've got the objects identified, you're gonna wanna spend some time understanding the security controls. And at this point, you're likely starting to map out some specific attack types. So you'll kind of use that to inform which security controls you want to go in and test. But this, I want to be clear, you'll go through and identify some initially. You will need to come back to this. So a lot of times you'll go through and identify some things, and then when you get closer to where you're actually talking about possible attacks, you'll probably have to come back and do a couple like validations and everything. But the goal is to understand some of the core security controls that are in there. And I have them, listed out in the kind of column in the middle there, right? Some of the main categories that I always look for, right? Authentication and authorization. How are they validating? How are they identifying the client? How are they identifying the role of the client? How are they determining what you're authorized to do or not, right? Is it OAuth scoping? Is it a value, like I mentioned earlier, it's in a JSON web token? Are they just validating a general session token, and then that session token allows them to pull a user context object from the database, and that value from the database includes the role and the ID and everything else? All of that is going to determine what's possible from an attacker perspective, and that's specifically looking at IDORs and access controls. Client-side execution controls, right? Is there a virtual DOM? Do they have a content security policy? What cookie flags exist? What is going to prevent you, if you get a cross-site scripting, from actually being able to weaponize that cross-site scripting? Because that's going to tell you whether or not testing client-side injections is even worth your time. A lot of times it may not be. State changing protection, CSRF, CORS, anything. When values are modified in the database, how are they validating that those changes are coming from the user that's authorized to do it, and the user wants to do that? That it is an intentional act and not something that they're being forced to do. And then data exposure and isolation controls, right? How are the different segments of the application isolated? What should a user be able to access and not be able to access between other users, between other tenants of the application? How do they prevent, in the cloud infrastructure, how are their S3 buckets set up to make sure that other people can't directly access that? All of these things. How do they ensure that only authorized users, I'm trying to think of how to put this together in my head, only authorized users can read the data they're supposed to read, right? You can't have somebody, an individual, whether they're a user or not, you can't have somebody read data that they should never be able to read, right? So we've gone through a lot of these, and my framework certainly has a lot of them listed out and everything too. Once again, this is another example of a place that is a muscle that you'll need to build up. This is another example where AI can help, right? Content security policy is a great example. Take the content security policy, just copy it, drop it in the free version of ChatGPT, and just say, hey, I always say it's my application. That's, with the AI stuff, but drop it in there and say, this is my application. This is my content security policy. Here's the technology. I have everything else. What could an attacker do if they were able to get a successful cross-site scripting? You know, AI can be really helpful there. You know, in the authentication controls, again, take a look at how the session is being handled. Is every endpoint validating the session from a cookie? Are they taking the session cookie and are they copying it over so it's an authorization header and it's sending that to the backend APIs? If that's the case, then it's very likely that that session token does not have an HTTP only flag on it, because they've got to use JavaScript to grab that and send it over. So yeah, how are they doing re-authentication, you know, OAuth, right? Or how are they handling the access tokens versus the refresh tokens, all that stuff. Authorization checks, like I mentioned, how are they validating the role? And then, yeah, CSRF defenses, does their CSRF token actually work? Is it a header and a cookie? And as long as those two match, then it's valid, in which case, once again, they probably can't have HTTP only on it, because that's probably going to be driven by a client-side JavaScript that's in there. So you want to go through and get a good idea, especially of the security controls you think will affect the attacks that are starting to be mapped out in your head. And then, again, once you get later in the process, you actually go through the threat modeling, you may need to kind of jump back and say, oh, okay, now I have this idea. Well, let me go back and specifically see if that's possible with the content security policy or the way they're identifying the client, things like that. Okay, so we've got a good understanding of the application. We have several different mechanisms that we have identified that we think are going to be valuable to test from the attacker perspective as a bug bounty hunter. We understand the trust boundaries. We understand how the back end is establishing trust with the client, because as I've said many, many times, HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means that every single HTTP request that is received by the backend, it needs to validate the identity of the client once again. There's no session, or obviously there's session tokens, but there's no actual session established to where where it's like a WebSocket, where you establish that connection to the WebSocket and then all data exchanged within that specific connection is automatically assumed to be coming from that specific client, because it goes through the specific connection. So we have that, we have the trust boundaries, we understand what objects we're going to be targeting, and we understand, at least at a high level, what security controls have been implemented to affect how we could build these attacks and exploit the mechanisms, target the objects, etc. Now we have a very, very important step. And this is something that a lot of people, even professionals that do threat modeling, I see that they skip this process. And I don't really understand why, because I think it's one of the most important processes. We are going to identify the crown jewels and the nightmare scenarios of this specific application, really of the combination of mechanisms and objects that we've identified, right? So the crown jewels, sorry, I got to get my coffee. The crown jewels, this is a specific data or a specific capability within that application that, if it was compromised, would cause the most real-world damage to either the users or the business itself. This is, right, if you break into a museum, are you going to the gift shop and you stealing a poster of the Mona Lisa, or are you going and stealing the Mona Lisa? Which one can you get more value from? And understanding this, understanding what is most valuable to attackers from the defensive side, allows us to anticipate the moves that attackers will make, and we can add in additional security controls to prevent that. From the attacker side, this allows us to build impact. This allows us to be able to, once we go and write our report and we identify the valid vulnerabilities, we're going to have a very clear impact, a very clear risk that we can articulate to the company and say, this is why you should care. This is this is what the attackers are going to take. And then the nightmare scenario, that's what keeps the security team and the executives and everybody in the company up at night. This is what a real attacker could do if the crown jewels were compromised, right? What could they actually leverage to either, how could they gain money themselves? How could they damage the company's reputation, their success, all that stuff? What keeps the security team up at night? And so I have a few different examples here. We have financial records, private documents, and admin privileges, three very common ones. So financial records, if an attacker were to get access to an application that stored sensitive financial records for a company, that attacker could exfiltrate the non-public financial data and use that to either trade or short a stock before earnings, and that could lead to regulatory violations, right? Serious legal exposure. That's a nightmare for the company. So you have, let's say, a company that is publicly saying that they're doing fairly well financially, but behind the scenes, they're actually bleeding money. And their quarterly reports, publicly traded company, and their quarterly report is about to come up, and they know it is going to be bad. So you, as the attacker, you have the ability to leak some of these financial records, and you can see that this company is doing much worse than what they're claiming publicly. And you know that this is going to be, a whole thing. So you go and you do a short on the stock, which means you're basically betting that that stock is going to fall dramatically in the future. And all of a sudden you get, it's essentially insider trading, but through their lack of security controls within there. So that's a really great way to show impact. Also, people watch those shorts. If there's some big short that comes through all of a sudden, those are public. People can start asking questions. Why did that happen? And if it gets linked back to, there was a breach, it is a nightmare for the company. This is a way that you can very clearly show impact on an application that holds financial records. Public document or private documents, rather, same type of thing, right? An attacker could steal confidential internal content, revealing credentials, PII, sensitive business decisions, right? Compromise, espionage, extortion. This is huge with AI companies right now too. I mean, there have been a couple case studies or breaches and exploits that led to internal documents talking about being much more candid about the impact of AI in layoffs and copyright and things like that. You have a lot of people that are trying to steal AI models is very common, right? So don't just think about it as documents, but anything more of trade secrets, anything that is intellectual property of the company that could possibly allow another company to overtake them would be another example, right? But anything that should be sensitive, that it should be kept secret, that's not. And then again, we're also talking about functionality. So admin privileges is another great example. An attacker can take over an admin account or elevate their privileges so they have admin access when they wouldn't. They could potentially have access to all user data. They could disable security controls. They could get persistent access. A lot of bad things could come from that. And really, when I wrote that, I kind of was thinking about it in the context of the application itself. However, we also think about getting admin access or access into systems or specific pieces of technology as well, right? If you have an IP address and you can directly get in there and potentially get SSH access on a web server that is hosting a web application, and then you can come from there, right? So you're changing the scope of the attacker. You're getting access to some system, some functionality, some data, anything that you should not have access to. And then again, what could you do with that? So yeah, an admin privileges, right? If you were able to disable all the security control, let's say you could get into the actual AWS account, you could disable their web application firewall, something, you can put some ransomware on it as another example. Any of those are possibilities, right? So getting access to data, getting access to systems, getting access to functionality, any one of those could be, crown jewels and have nightmare scenarios attached to it. Very important, again, that you identify these first, because every single item in our threat model is going to tie back to one of the crown jewels and nightmare scenarios. That's how we're going to show that impact. Okay. So everything we've shown up until this point has been the preparation for the actual threat model. So if you're on the blue team, if you're on the defensive side, then this would be everything leading up to a group process where you're going to get everybody into a meeting for probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. You're all going to talk through this. Everybody already comes in with this general knowledge identified. For you as a bug bounty hunter, right, you're going to do it on your own, and then you're going to go through and conduct your threat model. But this is what you want to make sure. These 5 steps you want to make sure that you have done before you go into the actual stride pieces and start conducting your real threat model, right? So the goal is focus. Eliminate random testing and ensure that every attack you consider has a plausible attack path and real impact, right? That's the reason that we do all of this. We have to understand the purpose and architecture, what mechanisms and trust boundaries we're targeting, what are the critical and high value objects, what security controls are going to block us from this, and ultimately, what crown jewels and nightmare scenarios are we going to point to that we know will have a real impact. All of this information together is going to be used to build out this threat profile and attack plan that we know is going to be viable if we actually find any failures of the security controls that we've identified. So we go through that process and then we get to STRIDE. So like I said, STRIDE stands for, every letter has a meaning, and it's the 6 categories that are, again, basically making sure that you ask yourself the right questions. That's really the value of this. And there's going to be some overlap. You're going to find out that an attack is going to have, it's going to affect multiple ones, right? It might affect spoofing, tampering, and elevation of privileges, or it might be denial of service and repudiation, or information disclosure and repudiation, right? So you're not necessarily saying, okay, spoofing is a specific attack. You're going to have some overlap here. Don't be too strict with yourself. The whole purpose is to make sure that you're asking the right questions. You're thinking about all of the different possibilities, and also not thinking about these ephemeral kind of research-based, like, maybe that's possible with this and that, right? But it's not tied into a specific attack that an attacker could execute. So STRIDE stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know what else I need to say. We're going to go through each one of these and do a deep dive on them. But again, it's just dividing the possible attacks up into 6 different high-level categories. And then we'll walk through each of them systematically to figure out what an attacker could potentially do with that. So our first one is spoofing. Spoofing occurs when an attacker is able to impersonate another user, a system, or a trusted component without legitimately providing that identity. So this is where we come back to those trust boundaries. How is the backend client establishing trust, or the backend server establishing trust with the client to say, yes, you are that user? And can we find a way to trick the backend into thinking we're somebody else? So on each one of these, if you look down at the bottom, I have the bold line. One of the things that I try to do with everything that I do, so this is whether it's learning about a specific attack like cross-site scripting or, server-side request forgery or something like that. Anytime I want to learn something, I try to boil it down to one sentence and make that sentence as few words as possible. So for every single one of these items on the STRIDE threat model, I've done that. So if you want to boil it down to one sentence, for spoofing, you are forcing the application to accept your identity as another legitimate user or trusted system. Now that can happen a lot of different ways. And I've got some examples here under the real world spoofing attacks. How does this happen? Well, can you reuse an OAuth token or a session token issued for one application to another API? So initially spoofing, if you can steal a session token, that's the easiest way of spoofing. You steal a user session token, now all of a sudden the application implicitly trusts that session token, so it believes that it's you, and you're able to execute things there. One thing that with spoofing that I see a lot of people don't think about is that you're spoofing your access essentially to other applications that you should not have access to. Essentially spoofing the legitimacy of an OAuth token or a session token. Session token is not as common, but what you do see is that with an OAuth token, there are mistakes that developers can make where they validate that the OAuth token is legitimate, but they don't validate the claims that are included within that OAuth token. And so now you're essentially spoofing as a legitimate user on a separate application or a separate API, because it's just validating whether or not that OAuth token exists or whether or not it's valid, as opposed to checking to see whether or not it should even work on that application itself. So that's one that, again, I think with spoofing, a lot of people try to go into, replacing a user or spoofing that you're a user. But again, also think about a system, think about a trusted component. That's very commonly how that works. Maybe there will be like an OAuth implementation set up to where you can access a third-party system, and it just validates the legitimacy of it, not whether or not you should even access to that system in the first place. So that's something to think about. Using tokens that are not bound to a specific user, tenant, or client, right? Can you get access to some type of a service token that's used and be able to impersonate that service itself? Sometimes web applications will leak that in responses and you can grab it. Impersonate users by swapping a user ID, a sub, email claims that loosely validated tokens. What we talked about before, if it's a JSON web token, maybe you don't need to spoof at the session validation level. Maybe they validate the session, but then they just trust the data that's in there. Say, okay, it says that it has this user ID. We're going to say that now we know that that's the user. Well, if you can control that value, now you have spoofed your identity, because there's two separate processes. They validate the session token over here. They validate the JSON web token, and then they just implicitly trust this user ID later. And so that's where you're making that spoofing. And then, yeah, forging and replaying sign requests. I talked about the pre-signed URLs earlier, right? If there was something that was, if the signature is not validated, that also goes back to the JSON web tokens, et cetera, right? But ultimately, you are forcing the application to accept your identity as another legitimate user or trusted system. There's a place on the back end where the something within your HTTP request is used by the server to validate that you are who you say you are. And if you can trick that mechanism into saying, yes, you are, when no, you're not, then you can accomplish spoofing. All right, moving on to tampering. Tampering is fairly simple, right? Tampering occurs when an attacker alters data that the application assumes to be correct or untouchable. The application does not believe that you have the ability to modify this data, whether it's you're not authorized to modify the data should be immutable, it should never change whatsoever, whatever it is. You are modifying, you're attacking the integrity. You're attacking the integrity of the data. You are modifying that data when the system believes that you should not be able to modify it. And then that is having unexpected downstream effects that you as a bug bounty hunter, you as an attacker, can leverage, can weaponize. So this often happens when servers rely on client-supplied input to enforce state changes, to enforce ownership and business logic. Even small changes to trusted fields can lead to unauthorized actions or data corruption. Going back to my example earlier with reset password, and you have that Boolean value to see have you validated your email or not. If you can change that Boolean value from true to false, you could potentially reset that mechanism, the flow of that mechanism, and then weaponize that to be able to either change the password yourself, or what's going to be a lot more likely is you get a client-side injection and you force the user to change their password without their knowledge, because it's at that point you wouldn't have that re-authentication step where you would provide the current password because the system believes you don't have a current password you've just validated, whereas the user doesn't believe that happened. So they probably wouldn't have the same cross-site request forgery restrictions on that endpoint, right? So that's where we tamper this one Boolean value. It now opens up the possibility for this other attack that wasn't available to us before. So a couple real world examples that I have here, right? Changing the object IDs to modify or delete another user's data. That's your IDOR, right? A state changing IDOR. It implicitly trusts the ID value from the client. It pulls up it says, okay, pull out that user object, makes the change or deletes it, doesn't validate to see whether or not your user should have access to it. That's an example of tampering. Altering request parameters that control roles, control pricing, control access, right? Is there something within a request parameter when you're adding a item to your shopping cart that either controls the price or maybe it's the quantity? Maybe you add one and that gives the price. But if you add -1, there's no validation on that, the negative versus the positive. And so it actually does negative amount, it decreases that from the overall cart, from the final price that you're going to be paying, right? So can you tamper with the logic of how it calculates the final price in order to be able to get something for less money than you would normally spend, or potentially get it for free? There's probably not a way you can force them to give you money, but banking transactions potentially. What if you could convert some type of a banking transaction to where instead of taking money out, it does negative money, and the logic on the back end actually adds that money to your account, so who knows? Injecting additional fields into JSON bodies processed by the backend. This is so common. Going back to this is why knowing what objects exist and what key value pairs are in those objects is so important. I see this all the time, especially with Node applications, right? You will send a request to a backend API, and it's some state changing thing. So you're modifying, let's say, a financial transaction or the data on the financial transaction. Maybe you're adding a note to it or something like that. And your request has 3 or 4 key value pairs. It's like note ID and, the note that you're adding or the note that you're changing, whatever, a couple different pieces there. And then the response is this big long object. They take the whole object and they return it back to the client side, and you can see all those key value pairs. Well, you copy that whole response, put it over there into your request, and now you can test each one of those key value pairs and see, will it allow me to change this? And depending on how the backend logic is written, if they do it correctly, they just take the key value pairs out that they need. They validate your ownership, validate your authorization, and then they go in and make those changes on only those key value pairs. What's easier, what's simpler, what's easier for the developers is to just take whatever object is provided from the client side, from the request, and just put that in there and make any changes that need to be made on any key value pairs that exist. This is a very, very common pattern, and that can allow you to tamper with some of those key value pairs that there's not actually a mechanism to allow you to tamper with. So that's something that you can definitely use there. And then manipulating client-side calculated values trusted by the server. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. If there's any type of like hashing or anything on the front, or definitely going back to your payment info, right? Like if you're checking out, but yeah, anything, if it's calculated on the client side, if that means they're trusting the client side values as opposed to doing that calculation on the server, that's a place where you can potentially manipulate that value. And right, like what if they're actually calculating the price? What if there's a client side JavaScript that when you add an item to the cart, it takes the initial price, it takes the quantity that you have in there, and it calculates the final price and it sends that in a request, right? Well, that you look at that and say, ooh, that should not be there. It should be calculated on the server side. So now I know that I can probably change that price to whatever I want and be able to do that. So, but yeah, fundamentally, boiling it down to one sentence, as few words as we can. You're going to modify trusted data you should not be able to control to change the application's behavior. And then ideally, you can weaponize that in some way. All right, now we're moving on to repudiation. Now, repudiation is something that gets overlooked a lot with bug bounty hunting. It's there are not a lot of cases where you can get a bug just by attacking repudiation, but this is a great way to show impact with other things like privilege escalation or, forcing a user to do something that they don't want to do. You can also attack the repudiation if you can prove that there's an additional step there. That's additional impact that can help sell your report. But there are some examples where repudiation can warrant its own bug bounty report. So if you look at the picture probably doesn't make too much sense to you, or I don't know, maybe it does, but those are logs. And the reason I put that there is repudiation is a lot of times you're attacking the logging of the system. So attacking the repudiation or manipulating the repudiation occurs when an attacker can perform sensitive actions without those actions being properly logged, attributed, or auditable, right? And it depends on what application it is, but a lot of applications, if they help support, like if it's a SaaS application that helps support an entire department, right? So I went back earlier, I said like let's say a HR SaaS product that like all the different, you've got, I don't know, I guess Paylocity would be one. I'm trying to think of, there's a bunch of them there, right? Or an example of a CRM, which would be used by an entire sales department, et cetera, So these systems, these applications, if the company is doing a SOC 2 or if they're publicly traded or if they deal with certain types of sensitive information, they're going to be going through audits. And the behavior within these applications, a lot of that sensitive behavior, there needs to be an audit trail of that. And so if you as the attacker can find areas where major changes are being made, where it's not actually being logged, then you can potentially show that additional impact or even a core impact there, right? So when a system fails to record who did what and when, the attackers then can deny responsibility, and defenders, they lose visibility into that abuse. So you can also show that you can get more persistence or you can have more of an impact because the defensive teams will not be able to identify, what's actually happening. And in bug bounty scenarios, this often amplifies the impact of other vulnerabilities, right? Like I said before, by making malicious activity harder to detect or investigate. And so we're talking about things that are just not being listed on there as well. So like not being logged, not being recorded. That can be harder to prove because there could be things going on in the back end. There could be additional telemetry and stuff that you're seeing. However, if you as the attacker can control those logs or delete logs, then it becomes much easier to show impact and have an actual vulnerability just related to repudiation. So a couple of the real world examples that I have in there, first of all, modifying or deleting data without generating audit logs, right? If I can, as an admin, come in and delete a user, or, as a user, go in and delete another user's, data or node or something like that, and there's no audit logs for that, then I'm going to be able to be a lot more successful as an attacker. Same thing, performing sensitive actions that are not tied to a user's identity. So if there are logs that are being created, but the log that's being created doesn't actually show who did it, so if it's, if let's say logs are being deleted and it shows that logs are being deleted, but it doesn't show who, it just says, log deleted on this date. Well, they're not going to be able to prove, non-repudiated. They're not going to be able to come in and say that this user did it. And so that would be another example there. If you can trigger background jobs, if you can trigger webhooks or anything like that without actually seeing where it came from or who triggered it, if it's just a general HTTP request that can come from anywhere, right? That can have a big impact on there. And then replaying request after a logout or a session expires as well. If a user's supposed to be logged out, if they're using that session to be able to establish the identity as well. Right, any of those can come. So I don't want to spend too much time on repudiation because again, it's kind of an additional thing that you would put on there. But ultimately, you have the ability to perform actions without accountability, or, and this is typically more applicable to bug bounty hunting, you have the ability to erase the evidence of those actions occurring in the first place. All right, this is a big one. I think a lot of people are going to understand this, not too complicated. Information disclosure. Information disclosure occurs when an application reveals data outside of an attacker's authorized access or intended consequence. If data is supposed to stay secret, if somebody's not supposed to see this data and they can see that data, you have an information disclosure. This includes to both direct exposure of sensitive data or indirect leaks that enable further attacks, right? If there's information on from the back end of the technology, the version numbers, what's actually happening, and where we can use that to find specific CVEs and go in and ultimately leak data or have some other exploit. That's another example of information disclosure. But obviously the goal, we want to tie it back to those nightmare scenarios, and a lot of time that means getting access to that sensitive data. So a couple real world examples. I'm going to stumble over that apparently every 3 times that I say it. So I try and work on that, but real world information disclosure attacks, right? You can access another user's data through an IDOR, a broken object authorization, right? Fairly simple. Switch the ID value. Now all of a sudden you've got access to a user's data that's supposed to only be for that user, or maybe within that company tenant, something like that. APIs returning excessive fields or metadata beyond what's needed. This can go back to the tampering as well. You can have an information disclosure that leads to tampering. That's where I was saying before, where you send a small bit of information, they return the full object. That's not needed. The client side doesn't need that full object. And now you as the attacker get to test whether or not you can tamper with each one of those key value pairs, right? So this is where attacks a lot of times affect multiple different layers of the Stride threat model, but these are all going into building our threat profile that we're going to use there. Error messages, leaking internal IDs, stack traces internal URLs that you can use to target for server-side request forgery. All of those are examples of information disclosure. You can try and submit those as a report. Some companies will take it, some won't. Or what I like to do is you sit on that information and try to use it to build a more impactful vulnerability that you can report there. And then, downloading private files, documents without proper authorization. Simple, easy. I don't think anybody's going to be confused about that one. Ultimately, information disclosure. You're able to expose information that an attacker should not be able to access. Pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Where's my clicker? There you go. All right, now denial of service. First of all, denial of service in a lot of cases is out of scope for bug bounty hunting. So you need to keep that in mind. I still like to included as part of the threat model. Obviously, it's a big part of the process. It is a big thing that defensive teams are going to look at because it's, that's typically important. However, and I have this listed up here, in bug bounty programs, the most volumetric DOS attacks. I don't know what that means. All right, anyway, yeah, this is, I don't remember where I got that word. Anyway, whatever. The most volumetric DOS attacks are out of scope, right? So yeah, I essentially what that means is like just hammering it, especially DDoS, right? DDoS, distributed denial of service, where you got a bunch of different requests coming in. That's not typically applicable to it. However, logical or application layer denial of service can be in scope. I don't know if I'd say is often. I probably should have made that a little bit soft, but you can potentially do it. You can ask them when it can be triggered by a single user or request. And these issues matter because they abuse normal functionality rather than overwhelming the infrastructure, right? So yeah, if you have to send X number of requests to the infrastructure in order to do it, 100% is going to be out of scope. But if you can find a specific payload that if you do this, will disrupt the system, or more importantly, like cost the company a lot of money. That's why I have costs listed over there on the side. Then that's something that a lot of times you can at least reach out and see if they want to accept it. I've certainly had a few accepted before. So a couple examples I've got there. Triggering expensive operations with small or repeated requests, right? If you can send a request, and this is becoming more common in AI systems as well, right? But if you can send a request and every time you send that HTTP request, it costs the company $5 and there's no restrictions to the amount of times that you can do it, and you just set up a Python script to go bing, 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 bing. And then on top of that, you can spoof your IP address, so that your IP address, they have some type of IP blocking if they caught you doing that, and you can easily just cycle through the different IPs. Now, all of a sudden, you're getting into a denial of service that could potentially be reported. Supplying large or complex payloads that cause excessive processing, right? Backend servers should be validating that all of the user-controlled input is, first of all, it doesn't have the malicious characters that it shouldn't have, it is the type that it should be, and it is the size that it should be. If we're looking for a string and we're expecting a username or an email address, and they send in 10,000 A's, or like the largest HTTP request they could send, that should be kicked back by the backend, right? It should be a validation that they do there. So if they're not validating that and they're just passing that off to some type of complex process that's either takes a long time and you have a limited number of threads, or it costs a lot of money, that's another area that we can do there. I mentioned before, abusing backend jobs, exports, report generation failures, right? That's very common, right? So if you have a process that goes through and does this big database query on the back end to build this report, and it takes, it says we'll send you an email with the report when we're done, and you can trigger, 10,000 of those happen by sending 10,000 HTTP requests. Once again, that's something that could potentially lead to a valid bug bounty report. And then resource exhaustion as well. If the back end is allowing the client to supply its own regex, and that's being passed in there, you could get a regex DOS. If you could trick it into doing, continuous loops. Recursion is used a lot in there. Ultimately you get it right. MongoDB, if MongoDB or Postgres database allows you to do your own functions, and you have a way to inject a malicious function into there or something, then you can exhaust the resources, cost the company a lot of money. If one or two HTTP requests can bring the whole system offline, then this is probably something that you can look at. So again, don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not as applicable to bug bounty hunting, but definitely if you can exhaust resources or incur excessive cost to degrade the application functionality, that's an example of denial of service and could certainly be a good bug to report. And then finally, in stride, the last one ended with E, elevation of privileges. Once again, this is something that a lot of people are very familiar with. Elevation of privileges occurs when an attacker is able to perform actions reserved for more trusted users, roles, or systems. So they can do something that they're not supposed to be able to have access to, and it allows them to get functionality that is greater than the functionality that they currently have overall. So this often results from missing or inconsistent authorization checks, role confusion, chain flawed access across multiple mechanisms, right? In bug bounty hunting, these issues are high impact because they frequently unlock admin functionality, access to sensitive data, or irreversible actions that could be used as malicious. So again, this is fairly common. The one thing that you need to think about with elevation of privileges is I see this a lot where people will test a couple different mechanisms, a couple different endpoints, and when they see that those authorization checks are being performed successfully, they'll say, okay, they've got this, there's no way to get, a access control violation here. I'm probably not going to get elevation of privileges. What you have to understand from the developer side, from the defensive side, every single endpoint that's created, there is an opportunity for an authorization check to be missed, to not be included in there. And the more complex the authentication and the authorization is, the more opportunities we have for that. So it's very, very difficult to make sure that you have consistent authorization checks across all of your endpoints. It's very difficult to scan for that. It's, static, if you're checking the code patterns, you're using like semgrep or something, or sneak to check the code patterns of the code before it comes out on the defensive side, you would have to provide that tool with the context of how you perform these authorization checks in order for it to identify this. So this is one of the reasons that I always champion IDORs and access control violations as a good bug to start on, because it has to be done the right way every single time. They're super boring to test for. It's super tedious because you've got to just go, okay, this person shouldn't be able to do this. Can I do this? No. Can I do this? No. Can I do this? No. And you'll probably do that 100 times. But out of those 100 times, you might find, can I do this? Oh, I can. And I'm not supposed to be doing that. And then that ends up being a $5,000 bug or even more than that, right? So that's really the experience with it. But it's really important to understand that with elevation of privileges when you're testing that. It's very easy to assume that those authorization checks are implemented consistently across all the endpoints. Very rarely is that the case. And the more complicated the authentication gets, the more that we have, we have authentication with email and password. And then we also have OAuth that we can use a few different services. We can use Google and we can use Azure and this and that. And then we also have a desktop application that has its own authentication. And then we have a Chrome plugin and a Firefox plugin. And both of those have their own implementation, right? All of that complexity going into an authorization check for every single endpoint, it can be very, very difficult for the developers. So elevation of privileges, obviously a big one. Remember to test everything, every possibility, and you'll kind of build your attack based on how you would get the most impactful elevation of privileges. So a couple real world examples. I'm sure this is not going to be surprising to anyone. If you can get access to admin only APIs or an admin panel as a standard user, that's very common, right? I mentioned earlier, if a user is admin, there's a little settings button on the top. They can click on that. It will navigate over to the admin settings. However, the developers never thought about the fact that somebody could just go in and enter /admin/settings as the endpoint, and it doesn't actually check to see if you should be able to be authorized to access that, and it will let you go through and do all of those additional actions. That's an example of it there. Performing privileged actions by modifying your role or your permission fields. Once again, you've got a JSON web token. The JSON web token, it validates the JSON web token, but it allows for the none algorithm as well, because that was a little debug thing that developers did, but they forgot to take it out. And so you now have the ability to send a JSON web token with a none algorithm, and within the payload in the body, you see role user. The key is role, the value is user. You modify that to admin. Now all of a sudden you have the ability to act as an admin there. Can you chain IDORs with weak role enforcement to expand access, right? Can you use an IDOR to make a modification that only an admin should be able to do, or make a, do an action that only an admin should be able to do? But because they never expected this specific user, this specific role to try, and because that object level authorization broke down, when identifying the client broke down, now you subsequently have the ability to perform these actions that you wouldn't normally be able to do. And then reaching restricted functionality by bypassing intended user flows. That's kind of like I mentioned before, just navigating over to the admin settings. Or maybe there's a sequence of HTTP requests and responses, and one of those is within that process, one of those validates your role, but if you just drop that request and send the next request, it begins that process as if you had already been validated. It just implicitly trusts that if that request later down in that sequence comes in from the client, it would only get there if everything else was successful. So it just makes the assumption that that authorization check has already happened, and now you can get that there, right? Fundamentally, we're going to gain capabilities beyond those that were originally granted by the application. So that is stride threat modeling, right? STRIDE, spoofing, tampering. Gosh, now I've got to do it all for my head. Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, or elevation of privileges. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we are going to walk through this process beginning to end with a hypothetical application. And we're going to go through and understand how the application works, what problems it solves, find some mechanisms that we would target, and then go through and identify what might be some of the results of that stride threat model there. And you see here the 4 main steps that you're going to do, right? We've already talked about this. Understand the application's purpose and the problem it solves, identify the mechanisms, the notable objects, and the security controls along with the trust boundaries, Then we're going to go through and conduct our stride threat model, going through each one, STRIDE. And then finally, we're going to map the results of those stride threat model to real world attacks and CWEs that we can go in and test, right? And this is exactly what experienced bug bounty researchers do when they're building out their plan to do manual testing. And again, by the time we get to the end, we're going to have 3 possible attacks that we can go in and test that we are going to be very confident if the security controls we've identified break down, and we're going to know exactly what those are and what needs to fail, then we're going to have a great report that we can submit, make some money. Okay. So here's our hypothetical application. It's called FinNote. FinNote is a SaaS financial collaboration platform, used by financial teams and executives to store, review, and collaborate on internal financial notes, on financial forecasts, and to make commentary on transactions, right? So you have the accounting team, you probably have some HR users involved, you got all the finance teams, everything, you got procurement that's going to be involved with this, and then you got the executive team. And this platform, every single financial transaction that a company does, every single account that they have, including the balance and the account numbers and all that information is stored within this platform. And the executives can come in and ask questions. Hey, why did we pay this much for this? What is this being used for? They can asynchronously collaborate with the different departments, different teams, different individuals to ultimately manage the financial success of the company. A lot of valuable data in there. So we're also going to note it supports multi-user access within companies, and it's designed to centralize sensitive financial context in the decision-making and earning preparation, blah, 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 right? It's, again, we get to collaborate. They get to, everything is stored in one place, and everybody can make decisions based on the information that's in there, right? The financial team can coordinate with the procurement, coordinate with the executives, and ultimately make sure that the company stays financially healthy, right? So a couple things we're going to note off the bat. So we've gone through and we're identifying, we now know the high level data that's stored in there. We understand the purpose. We understand who's going to be using this, right? There's not going to be individual users outside of the company that are using this. There may be some third-party individuals that are given access to this, and that would be an integration, something else we can look at. But for the most part, the users are going to be people within the company in different departments. So you would not expect somebody outside of the company to have access to that. So that would change how we would target them as victims. So this application, it has a web-based front end built in React. That tells us a lot about what's going to be possible from a client-side injection perspective, right? We're going to have a virtual DOM. So unless they explicitly use the dangerously set inner HTML method, we're not going to be able to get a traditional reflected or stored cross-site scripting. But there are some other vulnerabilities that could come from React that we could weaponize as well. But we know that's already going to start shaping what we potentially can do and can't do from a client injection perspective. We have the REST and JSON backend API. So all state changes made to the existing data are done through a single backend API, a RESTful API that uses JSON. This tells us, or at least starts to frame, that potentially things like cross-site request forgery and CORS misconfigurations are going to be within play, to where we can potentially get force a user to make changes that they didn't intend to make. We can also think about how, we can identify how the backend is identifying the client, get a potential for IDOR, figure out how they're doing authorization checks, et cetera. It does have OAuth-based authentication in addition to anything else we have. So that's a note that we want to make. First of all, we can attack any of those OAuth flows themselves. We can also attack the way the scoping is being validated and identified as well. So OAuth-based authentication is something that you would always want to note as you're going through the high level, understanding of the application. And then finally, data is segmented per user and per company. So what does that mean? So you log into an individual user account and you log into a company tenant. So when a customer is given an instance of this application, they are given a tenant that is logically separated, really based on just an ID. It's an umbrella. And within that tenant, there are multiple different users. And the company itself, there's multiple different companies for every customer, right? Multiple different umbrellas that are all under the larger application. So those are two different trust boundaries that we can start to exploit. We can try to bypass. First of all, within the company tenant, we can try to target other users to leak data between those users. And that would be fairly high impact, especially if you can get it from a user that you shouldn't have access to, or data that you shouldn't have access to. We also have this per company boundary. So if I'm a company A and I'm a FinNote customer, but I can do an IDOR not to just access the data of another user within my company, but I can access the data of a user from an entirely different company. That's going to be so much more impactful. So this tells us we've identified two different trust boundaries that we can test, but we also know that because they have per user and per company, anything we can get from that per company boundary is going to be exponentially more risky. So as I'm just looking at this, as I'm doing my initial review, again, I understand who I'm targeting. I understand how this works. I'm starting to get an idea, right? These internal financial notes, transaction things, the account numbers, all of those are going to be good targets. We know that client-side injections are going to be fairly difficult because of the front-end technology. We know that we're going to have a lot of opportunities for things like tampering and spoofing within the REST and the JSON backend. We know that because the OAuth-based authentication, that we're going to have opportunities to manipulate those flows and potentially get, once again, spoofing, potentially get escalation of privileges if they're not validating the scope, things like that. And then we know, because of the way data is segmented, we know how we can specifically craft our access control violations, our IDORs, things like that. So gives us a really good bit of working information. Now we're going to go through and gather a ton of additional information for it. So this is where we're getting our mechanisms, we're getting our notable objects, we're getting our trust boundaries, and we are identifying the security controls that are going to have an impact on that, right? So as we go through, just for the sake of this hypothetical exercise, we identify the four mechanisms on the left-hand side there. So first, we have the ability to view financial notes. That's a read mechanism. And the trust boundary there is that the backend API implicitly trusts the authenticated session to authorize that note access. So there is a session token included in a cookie that is sent to the backend API. The backend API validates that. And then once that's validated, it will allow the user to view that financial note, that sensitive data. So what are the notable objects that we're targeting if we're going to attack this mechanism? Well, it's the financial note records, the actual data within the note that we want to get, as well as the user accounts, because the user accounts are what is going to link to that session token. that we can store there. So, if the session token is a JSON web token, can we modify that? Can we attack the verification of it, of validating the signature for integrity? If it's just a general session token, how can we, this goes back to, spoofing. Is it tampering or spoofing? How can we go back and do it? So I'm constantly, as I'm getting deeper and deeper and I'm learning more and more about it, I'm starting to map these to each of those stride objects, and starting to get an idea of what those threats potentially could be. We can also edit financial notes. So the trust boundary here, the backend client trusts the client supplied note IDs and fields for the ownership and state changes, right? So it's still going to validate that session token to see whether or not you're authorized to be able to send that. Otherwise you're going to get a 403 response. But we've also found that it identifies the note that's being modified through a client-side value there. So if we can get control of that client-side value, and if it will trust the value that we give it, then we're going to be able to make changes to these financial notes. And then what are the downstream impacts of that? Well, this person said that a transaction was for one thing. We change it to say that it was something else because we're stealing money from the company. And so we want to be able to go in and trick people long enough so that we can keep stealing money from the company, so that we got enough money, we're going to hop on a plane. I'll be down in Aruba. You'll never find me again. So that's another way of showing impact there. Also have the ability to share notes with team members. So we have sensitive notes that are behind access controls. However, the person who writes the note or somebody with a higher level of privileges has the ability to share that note out with other team members to give them access to it, right? So the trust boundary, the back end trusts that the role and permissions are assignments when they're granted access. So when this process goes through, the back end just assumes that whatever is given is a valid access control configuration. It basically implicitly trusts these access control lists. And that's what's going to be on the notable object, right? The access control list itself would be an object that would be attached to the note. So the note there, it'd be a nested object to say access control. It would say who has access to that. Any user that's on that list, the backend is implicitly going to trust, okay, it has the ability to do that. Or it has the ability to access that. So can we, tamper with that in some way in order to manipulate it? Can we get a higher level of privileges to where we can add this, et cetera? Again, I'm just brainstorming. We're getting to the stride. And then finally, we're going to look at search and export notes. So we have all the different notes that have been added to all the different individual financial notes and transactions and everything else in there. So there is functionality within this application to search through those notes and export them specifically to facilitate an external audit that comes through every year, right? So the back end and the trust boundary, it implicitly trusts that the request parameters coming in to scope the results and export the content are generated by the front end, which automatically determines, it will basically scope that down to what that user has the ability to access. And the notable objects would be any of those financial data, the note, things like that, as well as an actual report export. There essentially be a large data object that's created from a lot of different database queries in the back end, and then that object will be used to do the bulk financial data, right? So as we're going through our threat modeling, we're going to specifically be looking at the mechanisms within FinNote that allow us to view or edit financial notes, as well as share notes with other team members or search and export notes, right? And these are all kind of mapping back to what are going to become our crown jewels and nightmare scenarios. So it's fairly obvious probably what a few of those crown jewels and nightmare scenarios would be, given what we're starting to identify. Now, the security controls. We've gone through and identified some information about the security controls. Again, we'll probably have to, as we get deeper and deeper, we would have to come back and test specific things, especially when we get to the actual attack. But we can get a lot of information that tells us what's going to be possible and what's not. So first of all, our session and token controls, right? How is our authentication and authorization? Well, we have cookie flags implemented. We see HTTP only, secure, and same site. Those are implemented on these session tokens there. So that's going to have an impact on our ability to, if we get like a client-side injection or how we can do CSRF, things like that. We also have both OAuth and JSON Web Token claims that are involved in the validation of the client, of the identity. So once again, that opens up, that tells us with the OAuth, we have the ability to do things with spoofing. We could potentially tamper with that process or tamper with the OAuth token itself. Same thing with the JSON Web Token. We can validate, we can try to spoof if we can steal someone else's. So within the context of these security controls, right, it's telling us what's possible and what's not. Client-side injections are looking more and more difficult because of the cookie flags. However, spoofing and tampering is looking a lot more viable because of the complexity of OAuth and JSON Web Token claims. Object authorization enforcement, right? This is your IDORs, essentially. How are we preventing IDORs? So the server side checks ownership based on note ID, user ID, and company ID. So essentially it takes that value from a client-side parameter, from a get parameter, a body parameter, a path parameter, and then it performs a check to determine whether or not that user has ownership on it. So if any one of those checks fail, because it's being supplied from a client-side value, and specifically a parameter, it opens up the opportunity for IDORs. It opens up the opportunity for failures here. Whereas if they just validated the session of everybody that came in and created a user context object and used that user context object to determine the identity and the ownership, it would make IDORs much less possible. So IDORs now are feeling much more in play than they would be otherwise. And then as well, you have consistent authorization across view, edit, share, and export. So yeah, so we're doing the same thing on every single one, but that just means that all they have to do is fail to do that, or you have one developer that decides to do a new code pattern. So doing consistent authorization is better, but we still have the opportunity for the developers to forget to implement that. State change protections. We do have CSRF tokens that appear to be tied to the active user session. So that has a few different implementations. So it's good that that CSRF token is not just some static token that can be used whether the user is logged in or logged out. However, because it's tied to the session token, it opens up more opportunities for spoofing if we have the ability to get access to that session token or force them to send a request. CORS as well, it's implemented with domain restrictions, but how those domain restrictions are implemented is going to determine how we're going to be able to do that. And also, is the API on a subdomain, or is it on the same root domain? Is it on the same domain, rather, same fully qualified domain name that the rest of the application is? If not, then CORS wouldn't be implemented. So, but here we see that it's implemented with some basic domain restrictions. We're going to hope that we can break those down in our actual attacks if needed. API response, right? They have field level filtering to note data in the responses. That just means that they're filtering out data that doesn't need to come back before they return the response. So that's going to make tampering a little bit more difficult. And we talked about making changes to those key value pairs that may have downstream effects. So that's something that we'll have to contend with there. And also we have the suppression of internal IDs and access to metadata. So they are doing everything they can to restrict the internal information, version numbers, jobs that are running, things like that from the user. However, so we're going to have to do more guessing there. And then finally, client-side controls for the client-side execution controls, specifically the content security policy is what we're looking at here. The script source is restricted, so we can't do unsafe inline or unsafe eval, right? So that's going to be much more difficult. And then the connection source has limitations preventing data exfiltration. So it won't be as easy to steal that if we got a client-side injection. This is essentially telling us that client-side injections, cross-site scripting are going to be much more difficult, right? So I know this is a lot of stuff here. This is really where, when you're doing this yourself, AI is going to be super helpful. If you need it. Again, this is where it shows that this is a muscle that you build up, right? So you'll go through and gather this information. A real application, you would end up with notes that would be so long, right? Tons of different mechanisms that you can identify. So a lot of times you'll come in, gather some information, go in, do some tests, do your threat modeling, all that, and come back and forth, back and forth. It's that continued ebb and flow that I'm always talking about. But hopefully at this point, you're starting to put together a picture of at least what the nightmare scenario or the crown jewels and nightmare scenarios would be, and then ultimately what maybe some of those stride threat model items would be, or what the attacks, downstream would be. Because you really want to go into that stride threat model already having an idea for a couple different attack possibilities, and then you're just going to put those within the context of each item in stride. But you also want to make sure that you're not pigeonholing yourself, right? You need to go in with an open mind that like anything else could come up as you're going through it. So we have a good amount of information here to where I would be comfortable moving forward with a threat model of those four mechanisms. So again, before we actually get into the threat model, we're going to identify really specific crown jewels and nightmare scenarios. And the ones that we have here are going to be very similar to the ones that we were looking at before, but just more specific to our hypothetical fintech application. FinNode, I think is what I call it. Would be a bad name, by the way. If you're going to start fintech company, don't put fin in the name. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, I got to stop getting off track. So the three crown jewels that I've identified here based on the information we have is first those financial records. I think we've already kind of dialed in on that. That's what a lot of the mechanisms that we're looking at are, is things that either read the financial records or modify the financial records in some way, et cetera. So that's probably our top crown jewel, which is that user data. And if we can especially get it, so an attacker exfiltrates non-public transaction data before earnings are released. They use this information to trade or short the company stock ahead of the market. This leads to market manipulation, regulatory violations, and severe legal exposure. That's your nightmare scenario related to this financial record. So any attack that we have, that we ultimately end up with in our attack plan that we're testing that is targeting these financial records, we can now loop it back to this nightmare scenario if we get any successful ones to show exactly how we could do this, exactly how we can make that nightmare scenario happen. But yeah, financial records, sensitive user data, very important. If you can get access to sensitive data within your company tenant, that's good. Bad for them, right? Good for a bug bounty hunter. If you can get access to sensitive financial records from another company that you don't even have access to, that's your critical. That's your big. So as we're moving into this stride threat modeling, we're also considering the way that they're separating between user and between company. And we're always trying to lean towards that company segmentation so we can have a greater impact. Another one is user account control. So getting access to another user's account. And if attacker takes over an executive or a financial user, right, we've got different users with different privileges. They could potentially get that additional privilege to access that data. They can manipulate the financial data. They can manipulate approvals as part of an audit process. They can manipulate reporting workflows. All of this can result in fraud, unauthorized financial transactions, material misleading financial statements. If you are a publicly traded company, it's really important that your financial statements are correct when you go through like your SOX audit, things like that. So we can target other individual users. And once again, I mean, this is really focused for within the company tenant. However, if you can get access to another company's user, much greater impact there. And then finally, admin privileges. So focusing really on, as opposed to if you're a regular user, getting access to the admin where you can control all the different security controls and everything within the tenant. You can invite new users, you can create persistence, things like that. So getting access to admin privileges when you're a regular user would have a huge, huge impact. In the nightmare scenario, right, the attacker takes over an admin account with an unrestricted platform access. They read all the user data, they disable or weaken security controls. It enables persistent compromise and a complete loss of platform integrity. So getting access to a user account would be bad. You get access to an admin account would be worse. You get access to an admin account on another company, it doesn't get more critical than that. All right. So we now have a very clear picture about the types of mechanisms or the specific mechanisms we're going to target, what we're going to target, how we're going to target them, why we're going to target them, what types of attacks that we're going to do. We are now ready to move into our stride threat model. So we'll start with spoofing. And what I've done is I've identified two different threat items for each one of these. So first of all, looking at spoofing with all of the additional context, right? It's the most common spoofing that you're going to see is a client-side injection like a cross-site scripting that steals the session token. That's the easiest. Very rare that you're going to find something like that in a modern application, because there's, I mean, you can, right? It depends on what it is, but a lot of things have to go wrong. We've already seen that the content security policy with the connection source is going to make it difficult for us. We're not going to be able to get inline scripts, which means we're going to have to do something to like import a separate script, and it'll depend on where we can actually import those. Import an external script, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. We know that there's a virtual DOM. So getting a client-side injection is going to be more difficult, right? So ultimately, the spoofing, because of all that context, we now can move our spoofing over to really look at things like the OAuth tokens and the identity claims that are made as a way to spoof, because it's not going to be as viable based on the security controls in the architecture to try to just steal a session token like you typically would, or the easiest way to do that. So our first spoofing is cross-client OAuth token acceptance, right? So the attacker presents an OAuth access token that is issued for another client. So essentially they have, the access token has been generated. We've been able to steal that access token based on the flow of OAuth and essentially identify that you know, we are that client there, specifically for separate applications as well. Right? So the targeting mechanism, the OAuth-based authentication for API requests. So this access token is used as a way to validate that the user is authorized to be able to make these changes or do whatever the API is doing. You know, the trust boundary there, the API trust that the token issue or trust the token issuer without validating the intended client. So essentially, when you get this access token, within that access token is a value that identifies which clients should be able to this access token should be able to access, right? So like if you get a wristband, right? If you think about an access token like a wristband, and you're at a music festival, right? And there's different parts in the music festival, and depending on what you can do, you know, if it's a green or a pink or a blue bracelet or whatever, you can go in and do different places. Well, what has happened is the developers are validating the legitimacy of the access token, but they're not validating this AUD value within the access token, which identifies which intended client this should be used. And so you're able to essentially authenticate and authorize yourself to perform actions within the API, even though your access token is intended for another client. And so however the API works, whatever it allows you to do, those are the objects that you can target. You can target user accounts, you can target the financial notes, the admin-only APIs, anything like that, depending on if they're not validating the intended client, then they're not really going to validate the scope as well. So this is kind of a failure of fully processing that OAuth access token. They're just taking that access token and trusting it once it's validated as a legitimate access token and allowing you to perform any actions within the API. Now, we don't know if this is happening or not. Remember, right now, we're just planning out the possibilities that could happen, but this is a possibility. And so it's worth it for us to do a simple test of taking an access token that's meant for one application and sending it to another application, being able to do that. It's worth it also for us to be able to try and manipulate the OAuth flow in order to get access to another user's access token. If we can change like the redirect URI, or again, I mentioned the state token, everything like that, then we could potentially get access to that and leverage it as well, right? So that is one potential threat. We don't know if it's possible or not. We know that if everything goes wrong, it would be possible based on everything that we know about the application. So we have enough information there to say that it's potentially worth testing. We know that this is possible, so we'll document that there. Spoofing number 2, we're going to forge the identity claims of API requests, right? So the attacker injects or modifies identity fields such as user ID or email. This is your strict IDOR, right? The API is authorizing the API authorization, is relying on a value in the request body or the headers or a get parameter, that ID value. It's taking that user controlled ID value and it is testing that against how it identifies the user and determining whether or not they have authorization to be able to access that. If they fail to do that security check, we now know that we have the ability to access, notes or whatever it may be that we shouldn't be able to access, right? So the broken trust boundary is the back-end trust client supplied identity attributes. This is your traditional IDOR, very, very common. And the notable objects that are affected, right, it's going to be the user accounts themselves, which is going to have the user ID or the node ID, the node ownership, however that's established, and then any audit records or log records that are created as well. Ultimately, the attacker is able to perform actions as another user without actually getting any type of authentication bypass. They're just leveraging or exploiting the fact that the developers failed to validate the user-controlled input to the identity or their understood identity of who is making the request. So a couple very good opportunities for spoofing that we know is going to be possible, that there's a high likelihood, or maybe not a high likelihood, but at least a higher likelihood than something like a traditional, oh, I got a reflected cross-site scripting and I can steal your session token. Because we know, because of the security controls and the architecture, that's very unlikely. So we're not going to at least invest a lot of our time in the beginning doing that. Next is tampering. Once again, tampering, we want to modify data that we should not have the ability to modify, and that's going to have some type of downstream effects. So the first one that we have for tampering, unauthorized modification of object identifiers, right? Goes back to exactly what we were talking about before. This is where you see some overlap, some spoofing and tampering, right? There's some that specifically tend to overlap a lot, but this can be very similar, and it's all going to go into that threat profile. And this is just another data point that can point us to that final attack. So because we've got something here in spoofing and in tampering, right, my mind is immediately starting to go to IDORs. This seems like a good opportunity for us to test a lot of IDORs because we're seeing that this client-side value is being used to determine this authorization check is being used to access the node. Once again, if it was done with the user context object, these two would not be listed on our Stride threat model because it would be a completely different threat profile. We would not be able to do it. But because they are trusting the values of parameters to identify these nodes that are being accessed, that are being modified, now it opens up not just for spoofing, but also for tampering, right? So the attacker modifies the node ID values in the API request, and this is to view or edit the financial notes. Once again, the trust boundary, the backend trust client-side object identifiers to enforce ownership. It's the exact same thing, but it works for tampering in the same way that it works for spoofing. And you're still going to be targeting the financial objects. You know, it's also going to involve those user, everything we talked about before, right? It's going to involve those user objects, access control lists, things like that. But ultimately, by tampering with that node ID value, the attacker can view, edit, or delete, other users' financial notes, right? So once again, don't be too strict with yourself and try to say, oh gosh, is this spoofing or tampering? No, put it in, if it makes sense for both, put it in both. And that's just 2 data points to point to that. So now my mind is definitely going to IDOR. As I'm starting to map these to the attacks that I'm going to go in and test, IDOR is seeing more and more like a valuable test, like it's worth my time. And then number 2 for tampering, we have hidden or undocumented parameter manipulation. Happens all the time. This comes back to what I was talking about before. You change one of those values in there that you shouldn't be able to change. Maybe they return all the key value pairs. Maybe you fuzz for it, right? Maybe use param miner in Burp Suite or use Arjong. I think it's Arjong. I don't remember. There's a Python one that finds for hidden parameters as well, right? But ultimately, the attacker adds undocumented parameters to the JSON request bodies. So for whatever reason on the back-end code, it is, even though the initial HTTP request did not include these key value pairs in the JSON request, you're able to add these values in, and it does have an impact on the way the back-end works. Right? And we're specifically targeting on this one, editing the financial notes with the hope that we can break the validation, right? So the trust boundary that's being broken, the backend process additional fields without validation. So it's not validating whether or not these, if this value was never meant to be changed, the backend code is not checking that or not checking to see if this exists before it goes in and makes that change. A lot of times this happens, especially with node applications, where it'll just take the full object given from the request and it'll change any values that happen to be in the back end in the response, or in the back end of the database and send it back in the response there, right? But we're finding additional functionality that the clients are not supposed to know exists. Whether it was deliberately put in there by the developers or it's just a consequence of a convenient way to build the mechanism, right? As opposed to pulling the values that they need from the client-side request and using that to modify the database. It just takes that whole object, throws it into the database, and it lets the tech stack itself essentially handle making those changes, and it changes anything that's applied. Very, very common. We can potentially pull metadata to do that, right? We can change metadata values. We can change permission values all the time. I mean, it just depends on what those key value pairs are going to be. But ultimately, the attacker alters the note behavior and visibility in unintended ways, and is able to manipulate that financial note, get access to that financial note, whatever it may be. So there's two that we can do for tampering. And again, my mind is already starting to map over to, well, we know that we've got this complex authentication with these different OAuth scopes, and we know that we have a lot of opportunities potentially for IDOR because of the way that they are identifying the notes, things like that. So I'm starting to map these to attacks as I go along. Next is repudiation. What are a couple things that we can do here? Once again, looking at the logs. So first, actions are not tied to a stable user identity. So the attacker triggers actions that are not consistently associated with the user ID, right? If I come in and a note is modified, it just says that that note was modified, but it doesn't say who modified it. So that can be more difficult to be able to identify for the developers, for the security team there. This is on note edits. This is on exports. Exports is a very big one there, right? You want to know if somebody's exporting this large amount of data, what are they actually exporting? Who is exporting it? You want to have all that documented so we can do it, or creating background processes as well. We can identify it there. It says the backend assumes the authentication context is always preserved. So it assumes that if the authentication is validated, then that is going to be essentially preserved somewhere. So they're just going to be showing the session, but the problem is there's no way to tie that session back to an individual user in the way that the logs are being stored here. So once again, this is going to be something that we could add impact on. So if we find the ability to, let's say, use an IDOR to modify a note, and we find that it shows that the note was changed, but it just assumes that, because only the user that wrote the note can change the note, it just assumes that they don't need to document the user ID. Well, now we have plausible deniability as the attacker to come back and say, no, he changed it. I didn't change it. What do you mean I changed it? And if we don't identify the ID, the IP address, anything like that, then the attacker can have plausible deniability with repudiation and show additional impact on that report. And then the other one, which this is really the big one, like I said, log deletion via application functionality. An attacker deletes or suppresses audit records through the application features. They're targeting the admin functionality, really, because really an admin is the only one that should be able to do it. Honestly, nobody should be able to delete or modify logs. Logs should really be immutable. If there is an issue where they need to be modified, then changes should be made to the mechanism that takes the logs in order to support that. Logs themselves should never be able to be changed. And it says there, broken trust boundary system trust that logs are immutable and protected from the users. The objects we're targeting, obviously the audit logs, any security records, compliance data, anything like that. Ultimately, the attacker erases evidence of malicious activity after the fact. It has the ability to create persistence. This is very, very common. It's amazing to me how often people don't think about this. And, even you can find functionality where they didn't even think about you'd be able to modify those audit logs, but you can potentially do that through some roundabout way, maybe attacking another system. And even if you can modify logs at all, like let's say an admin does have the ability to delete or modify logs, think about what users have the ability to do it. What if there is an auditor role, essentially, and that auditor role, there's a broken access control where there's an IDOR through that auditor role where that auditor can modify or delete those logs. That's huge. That's something that you should definitely submit to a bug bounty report, because then essentially the auditor has the ability to modify the logs that they're auditing, and that gives them a huge amount of power. And especially when you talk about legal consequences and everything, that can be a very impactful vulnerability. So again, for the most part, repudiation is building on the other things that we have. So if we can already spoof and tamper, and then on top of that, we can attack the repudiation to where they don't have plausible deniability, that's just additional impact that we can build to really show the company how devastating this could be if an attacker leverages it. All right, information disclosure. Again, we're probably going to have some overlap here with our spoofing and tampering because this is more of like the end result of if we were able to do that. So first, excessive data and API responses, right? Is there an API that returns fields that the user is not authorized to see or to use, right? This is fairly simple to test, but it's very straightforward or very possible, especially when you have an API, RESTful API backend for all state changes there. You know, it could be metadata, could be additional key value pairs within any of those. But yeah, ultimately, are any of these APIs going to expose data? And then could we use that for tampering? And then after we tamper, it results in a spoofing and boom, we get that IDOR, et cetera. This is all leading me to where I'm ultimately going to go with my attack plan. So yeah, the backend trust response serialization to enforce least privilege, right? It's just basically the same thing. It trusts that the identity of the client, how it validates the identity of the client is what it says it is, that it can't be spoofed, can't be tampered, etc. And ultimately, it leaks the internal context that enables an IDOR, enables a spoofing, enables a privilege escalation, etc. So we're not looking to specifically leak sensitive data right here. We're looking to leak information that will be combined with other items of Stride to be able to get a full successful attack there. And then the second one we've got for information disclosure is unauthorized bulk data export, right? So we talked about before, there's that mechanism that allows the user to export data from financial records, and the parameters that are provided are what determines what's being exported. Well, are they validating that user should be able to export all of those different values? This is something that happens a lot because it's a big complex process. They'll get those values in and go and do a bunch of data queries and joins and everything on the back end and not take the time with each of those because it's already a very resource intensive process, time consuming process. So they'll just kind of assume that the values that are coming in from the parameters have already been vetted essentially from the client side. And so you can capture them within Burp and be able to modify those, right? So the attacker is able to download more notes than intended via export functionality. So ideally, when this process goes through and it does a bulk data export, it's going to say, well, the user has the ability to access this and this and this, so we'll give them the results from this and this, but not from anything that's outside of their authorized scope. If that breaks down, this could be a very impactful information disclosure, and we don't have to do anything special. We don't have to do any spoofing. We don't have to do any tampering. It's simply a failure to check the authorization in this complex bulk export there, right? So we're going to be targeting the search and export notes mechanism that we talked about earlier. The backend implicitly trust that the request parameters to scope the export results are correctly scoped, that we cannot provide something that we shouldn't have access to. And again, if that fails, then we're going to be able to get it. And the impact is mass exposure of non-public financial data. So this in and of itself is kind of leading me to its own attack. You know, we don't need to get anything else special from here. We already have the ability to search and export notes. We just need to see if we can get this mechanism or the authorization built into this mechanism to break or find a place where it's not applied correctly. So now, as I'm mapping everything out, we've got the complexity of the OAuth authentication and where it's used in multiple different places. We've got the possibility for IDORs. And now maybe we can just get a bulk export to also get some data leakage there. Continuing to build this attack pattern up in my mind. Denial of service, again, we won't go too much into this, but first of all, abuse of expensive operations, right? So the attacker repeatedly triggers costly searches and exports, right? Can we send a bunch of those? Is there any restrictions to where if it's one HTTP request that goes in and starts the export, if we send 100 of them, is it going to do 100 exports? How much does that cost the company? That's certainly something that we can look at. We would want to talk to them first and find out whether or not that is, that's okay. That's something that we could submit, but I would at least have it listed on my Stride threat model here. And then another one that probably is a lot more viable is unbound input size or complexity with the financial note. So when we create or edit a financial note, do we have the ability to send extremely large or complex note content? And then what downstream effects does that have? So the back end implicitly trusts the input size, where I mentioned before, you need to be validating. Does it have malicious characters? Is it the type that you expect? And is it the size that you would expect? So we're not validating the size. And now there's going to be some, we can affect how much data can be stored, how much processing is done with these exports and everything. You can slow the whole application down. Happens all the time. Again, you want to make sure that you can actually submit these. A lot of times this is like repudiation, where you're building on the impact. If you can find a way to do this, right? You do the bulk export where you can export any data. And then on top of that, you can do it as many times as you want. So you can just keep exporting all of the data that's in there. And you can add in a huge amount of data on top of it. Then you're stealing the company's data, costing them a bunch of money at the same time. You can build your impact on there. But yeah, denial of service, just remember, bug bounty hunting, you have to make sure that the company is interested in the ones you're submitting. You don't want to get something that's out of scope or not applicable. So be careful with that. Use it to build on the impact. And finally, elevation of privileges. We've talked about these here too. So first of all, number one that I've got here is access to admin-only APIs. So there are API endpoints that allow an admin to make major changes to the instance, the tenant, invite new users, make changes to existing users, their roles, view information from all the users, all this stuff that you can do. So, and there's specifically some admin reporting and management features that are built into that we could target potentially. So the backend trusts the role context without strict server-side enforcement. So again, whether it's through the OAuth access token or it's coming through a JSON web token, there is a client-side value that is determining the role. And if we can find a way to convince the backend that we are an admin when we're not, then we are going to be able to do essentially anything we want. We get the full platform compromise through this API. So we just need to figure out how it's determining the roles through the API. We've talked about that. We have an OAuth, which an access token is exchanged for a JSON web token that has the role included within that payload. So now we just need to find out where the signature validation breaks down, or maybe it validates the signature. Well, no, I guess it still have to break down. So maybe it doesn't validate the signature at all. You'd be shocked how often that happens, by the way. It's a really good thing to check. Maybe it allows you to do the none algorithm. Maybe it uses HS256, which is a symmetric signing. And so you can find a way to figure out what the secret was to sign it, right? All of these are options there. And then finally, bypassing intended user flows to get an elevation of privileges. So the attacker directly calls privilege APIs without following the UI flow. This goes back to beginning. So the developers believed that there would be, that no one would know that the admin settings page exists there. And so as long as you can manually navigate to the admin settings page, then it essentially doesn't validate the role of the requests that are coming through there. It's just they made the assumption that if somebody is making these API calls, they were able to navigate to the admin panel because they saw the icon in the front end, and they never took the time to think about, could somebody just navigate there automatically? Once again, this happens more often than you'd think, right? So the backend assumes UI enforces access sequencing. That's all that means, fancy way of saying, that the user interface would prevent you from being able to access it there. Or maybe they thought that the user interface validated the session, the role of the session, and that broke down. The front end, the client side code is supposed to be validating before it even loads that the user is an admin, but that was a failure of another team, of the front end team, that didn't do that, but the back end team thought that they did. This is very, very common. And so they're building everything in their back end, assuming that the front end has already validated the role, and that doesn't actually happen. And then, of course, eventually you're able to act as an admin and go and do everything as you want there. All right. So we've gone through our stride, and of course we would end up having multiple different ones. Like this is a small subset of what we would do for a threat model. It's up to you how much time you want to invest in it. Again, it's just like with anything else with Recon or anything else in bug bounty hunting. Go until you feel like you have a good attack plan. Go in and make those tests, make those attacks, document the results, update any information you have on the security controls, the mechanisms, the high level, write your answers. It's always an ebb and flow. I'm going to keep saying an ebb and flow. Walk in a little bit, do some tests, go back out, find more mechanisms, do more threat modeling, use the information from the tests you already did to inform your new threat modeling. Keep going back and forth, and eventually, I mean, if there's a vulnerability to find there, you're going to find something there. All right. So once we've completed our threat model, we end up with our threat profile or risk profile, whatever you want to call it, right? So this is essentially summarizing what we've put together. And this is another place where AI can help a lot. Take all those different individual pieces that you have and feed it into AI and say like, hey, build a threat profile for this and all the different information that you have, and it can help you do it. Take everything it does with a grain of salt, go through and validate it, make sure that it's not missing anything, make sure to add your own stuff if it needs to be there, get rid of anything that doesn't make any sense. But especially when you're first starting with threat modeling, AI can be a really valuable resource at this step. So our FinNode application, we now have a lot of information about the threats that could potentially target it and the threats that are not really viable based on what we know. So when we're looking at identity and trust, we know that the OAuth tokens and the identity claims can be trusted outside their, or we know that potentially they could be trusted outside of their intended context, right? So that is going to inform the attacks that we're going to do. That's where we're talking about, can we potentially get an elevation of privileges? Can we get access to functionality that we shouldn't be able to get access to? If this happens, then yeah, and it's definitely possible based on everything that we know. We also know that it's possible for APIs to rely on assumptions about who the user is and not just whether they're authenticated, right? Can we force the application to make the wrong assumptions, right? Or can we find places where it's just checking to see if they're authenticated, but not actually making an authorization check, right? These are the different ways where we can exploit, or where the identity and trust security controls can break down that we can exploit as bug bounty hunters. For object ownership, financial notes are accessed via client-side identifiers, right? That is a threat. We know that because of that, as opposed to doing a user context object or something that's signed for integrity, we know that we now have the ability to test every single one of those endpoints to determine whether or not we can get unauthorized access based on those client-supplied identifiers. That is very, from a threat perspective, right? That's very high on my list, and that's very clearly mapping to some attacks that we can get into there. The ownership and role enforcement is inconsistent across mechanisms as well, right? If that happens, if they're trying to apply them consistently and there are areas where they apply them inconsistently, that's something that we as bug bounty hunters can attack and be able to take advantage of. And then, yeah, it says right there, IDOR style access is a dominant risk, right? So this is all leading to the fact that IDORs are very much in play with this application. If it just validated the session and that was how it identified the client every single time, was from just every request, validates the session, creates a user context object, this would be completely different. I probably wouldn't spend any time testing for IDORs on this API because it just doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to get the entire session process to break down, and that's so much more difficult. Client-controlled state and logic. So backend behavior depends on client-provided fields and request structure, and also unauthorized modification of note content, scope, or visibility is plausible, right? So they're putting this is a application. It's a React application. It's kind of a hybrid, but partially a single-page application. There's a lot of data and a lot of values that are being stored in the client side, which means they are available to the attacker to be manipulated. Now, what we don't see when we're talking about this client control state and logic, what we don't see on the client side is the ability to potentially inject a lot of value in there. So we're not talking about that, but we're just talking about the fact that the user has control over it, which gives them the ability to potentially break these authorization checks. So that's why we're moving more into the authorization side, authentication, authorization, identity, and trust failures are still kind of top of mind, as opposed to a lot of injection attacks that would come, if this was a completely different application. There's potential for insufficient accountability. Right? Sensitive actions may occur without reliable attribution to the audit trails, right? When we talked about the editing notes, right? It's possible that we may be able to edit notes or delete notes without them actually identifying what individual user did it, because they're making the assumption that the only person that can do that is a user that's authorized to do it. And then log deletion or suppression as well, right? There is a possibility through the API for somebody to come in and delete the logs when they shouldn't be able to. When they shouldn't be able to. And so that's something that we can, identify as a threat and potentially work into all of our attacks and all of our impact as well. Data exposure paths, so APIs could overfetch sensitive fields, goes back to the export that we were talking about, right? So there's the possibility, and again, because a lot of this is controlled on the client side, there's a possibility for these APIs to either return sensitive fields, return metadata, says the bulk access via search, right? So because that bulk access is being handled with GET parameters and on the client side as well, there's a lot of validation that has to happen on the back end. Whereas once again, if they used a user context object and then determined on the back end how that was done, then there'd be a lot less chance that would actually break down. Resource and cost abuse, we have the expensive operations, could be triggered over and over and over again, that's fine. The abuse leads to service degradation and financial costs. So if we can send a lot of those exports, certainly possible there, that we can show some additional impact. And then finally, privilege escalation. So there's admin-only capacities. That is one of the crown jewels that we're targeting. And if we can get that admin access, and it shows that because of the complexity of the OAuth authentication and because of the way that they're handling navigation on the front end, it is possible, it is a risk that we can get access to those admin capabilities that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. All right, so it's a lot in there. Again, I'm going to keep coming back saying this, it's a muscle that needs to be built up. But over time, and as you continue to do this and identify the mechanisms and map them out to the Stride threat model items and build the threat profile, it's going to be easier and easier. You're going to start to see a lot of patterns. So hopefully this, this process is giving you the tools to do that, or at least to start doing that. Again, use AI, use your group, use the community in Discord, ask people what they think, see if they have different opinions, and over time, you'll build this up. This will be a very, very valuable tool in your overall methodology for bug bounty hunting. All right, so as we wrap up, there are 3 attacks based on all the information in our hypothetical application that I have identified that I would go and test. So the first would be an IDOR, object level authorization bypass, right? We're going to attempt to access or modify another user's financial records by changing specifically the node ID values in both the view and request, or view and edit requests, right? We've already said FinNote relies on client-supplied object identifiers to reference the notes, which are high-value objects. That is one of our crown jewels, and it's tied directly to the ownership, right? That ID value is. The threat model identified that repeated trust in the client-controlled IDs to view, edit, search, and export mechanisms can be targeted, right? And you see that under the targeted mechanisms. This is a place where there's a lot of opportunities for this to break down because the ID value is being given in a parameter. So we're going to go through and test every single one of those. This is the number 1 test that I'm going to do. It has the highest possible impact, and it is probably the most likely based on what we've seen. We're going to be targeting those financial note objects as well as the user accounts that are tied to the ownership, right? So primarily the financial note objects. Now the security controls that are involved, right? We don't care about the content security policy. We don't care about cookie flags. We don't care about anything about that because we're not targeting another user within their browser. What does matter, server-side ownership checks. Are they enforced on every single request that is sent, every single API endpoint? We're going to go through and meticulously send every single one and see if we can access a note or modify a note. We're going to do this for every single mechanism. We're going to test every single endpoint on every single view, every single edit, every single search, every single export, every possibility that they have failed to add this ownership check. We're going to try and find that, right? Authorization independent of UI and request structure, right? So yeah, can we get access to a UI endpoint that we shouldn't be able to, or something else that we can potentially send it? But this is going to an API, so we'll see there. And then, yeah, is it consistently enforced across all note-related endpoints? Again, test every single one, every single way. And going back to our Stride threat model, this is related to tampering that we identified. It is information disclosure and potential elevation of privileges. So the results that we got from tampering, information disclosure, elevation of privileges, honestly probably could have listed spoofing there as well. I just kind of ran out of room, but there are many different items in Stride that are leading us to this. So that's what usually happens is you have multiple different items in the threat model, and then those essentially map to a specific risk or attack that we would go in and test. And then on the defensive side, they would build up security controls for that. So what I would do is the AppSec team, if I saw this and we were doing an internal threat model, is I would say, okay, we need a way to, we need a standardized way like a middleware to validate the ownership on every single one of these checks when the request comes into the API. And we need a way to scan the code to identify when it hasn't been applied. So that's what you hope they're doing there. And then on the offensive side, you hope that they did not do that and you can find gaps in this validation. All right, the next one, authentication context confusion. So looking for OAuth, I'm thinking of OAuth access tokens specifically here, potentially API keys if they're being used. But yeah, I mean, again, it's a hypothetical app, so we're having to make some liberties and stuff there. So can an attacker reuse or replay OAuth access tokens across different tenants, across multiple clients, across different APIs? Are they validating all of those pieces? Are they validating the scopes, the claims, everything within that OAuth access token? Or can we potentially expand our access to different functionality, whether it's new APIs, new endpoints, anything that we wouldn't typically be able to do that? Because FinNote uses OAuth-based authentication across multiple services, and the threat model identified assumptions that a valid token always represents the correct user, the correct tenant, and the correct client, right? So we as attackers are hoping that they are not validating these additional assertions of user and tenant and client context, things like that. So yeah, we're targeting the OAuth authentication, we're targeting session handling. We want to, ultimately we're still going to be trying to get access for the most part to the financial notes, maybe some additional functionality in there. The security controls that are potentially breaking here. First of all, the strict validation of token claims. Are they validating the AUD, the ISS, the tenant, the scope, all of these different things that are built into the OAuth process, the OAuth, I don't know what you call it, methodology, I guess RFC. It's built in the RFC is probably the best way to say it, right? Have they actually taken the time to do this, or are they just validating that the OAuth access token is a valid access token? And if it is, they just let everybody go where they need to go. Are the tokens bound to a specific client or tenant, right? Could we potentially get access by changing the values in the access token or something like that? Can we get access to another user, to another company's tenant, right? Is there some way that we can tamper or manipulate or spoof to where we could get access to that other company tenant? And then is the rejection of tokens or are tokens essentially rejected when they're used outside of their intended context, which goes back to that initial validation, right? Ultimately, that strict validation of the token claims is the most important part here, right? So this is going to lead to spoofing, elevation of privileges, again, tampering potentially. But really you're going to see, right? Can you steal a valid access token or a refresh token and use it to do that? Are they just not validating it on the back end? That's going to give us an elevation of privileges, whether it's, just new scope, new things. But yeah, ultimately we are attacking whether or not they are validating the token claims within that OAuth token. This is a very viable, and we would test the entire OAuth flow as well to see if we can spoof by stealing a valid access token, stealing a valid refresh tokens. Somehow we can get access to something we shouldn't by compromising these OAuth tokens. And then finally, the third one, and if client-side injections was a possibility, then this would be written differently. We would want to start with the client-side injection, but I think that that's going to be much more difficult. So we have just unauthorized state changes with either CSRF or logic flaws. And for the most part, cross-site request forgery there. So can we trigger note edits or deletions without a user intending to do that by replaying state changing request or omitting CSRF protections? We did see that the CSRF token was tied to the session token. So if that session token is scoped in a way and the same site is set in a way so that we could potentially get that to send from a malicious page, then we can do this without the need for a client-side injection. It also depends on how CORS is set up. So we would need a CORS. It would need to have CORS implemented, and we would need to have a CORS failure on top of that, right? But overall, we're targeting editing or deleting financial notes. Reading it isn't as valuable here because we're trying to make those state changes, but if you could potentially read it and get it, exfiltrate that data, that'd be good too. The security controls involved in an ideal state. The CSRF token is going to be tied to the active user session. There's re-authentication for any sensitive state changes. So if you're changing a password or modifying something, you actually have to go in and re-enter your password or anything. That's more for changing your password, stuff like that. But sometimes they're really strict and they have a full re-authentication. And then is there proper attribution as well, right? To see where the request came from. If you can get a cross-site request forgery to work, in the logging, it would just show that individual made those changes. It wouldn't say that the request came from this IP address or this, had this referrer header or anything. If you're not documenting that, then you're not going to have the repudiation to be able to go back to it. So, but ultimately, this is focused on tampering and repudiation. You want to have something set up where if their CSRF mechanism fails, if their CORS mechanism fails, depending on how it's set up, you can potentially make changes to these. You can delete the financial notes, and then that's going to have a whole bunch of issues when we come around to the auditing. All right, so that is everything that I wanted to cover for the slide deck here. So once again, we understood the application. We went through our STRIDE threat model that gave us an idea of the threat profile, and ultimately we recognized that because of the application, how it's made up, its technology stack, its architecture, its functionality, security controls, all that information tells us that the best use of our time is to first test for IDORs on each one of these endpoints, make sure it is validating that the claim is correct or that the identity is correct. Then we're going to go test how the OAuth access tokens are processed. Are they validating the claims within the access token? Can we get additional privileges? Can we get access to other applications we shouldn't be able to get to? All that type of stuff. And then finally, can we force a victim that has a valid account to make state changes, make changes that they didn't intend to, and as a result, they wouldn't be able to prove that they did not do it, which can be a whole mess of legal issues and everything for the company. So that's the overall process. Again, I'm going to keep coming back to this. It's a muscle, right? So this hopefully lays out the process as well as possible. The more you do this, the better you'll get. The more you work with other people and get their opinions on what you're doing and have them, right? You do what's called farming for dissent. So go out and, ask people, hey, here's what I'm getting based on this information. What do you see? If you're working as a team, that's going to be much, much easier, and you're going to get better quicker because different people have different, sets of knowledge and experience, and they're going to be able to identify things that you can't, right? So that's why it's always better to work with groups there. But all right, so to wrap up, threat modeling bridges the gap between reconnaissance and effective manual testing by turning assets into intent. Instead of drifting between random endpoints, STRIDE forces you to identify assumptions, trust relationships, and high-value targets before your testing begins. This approach increases signal, reduces wasted effort on the back end, and leads to findings that are more impactful, reproducible, and likely to be accepted. So your key takeaways from this presentation: Recon tells you what exists, threat modeling tells you where it can fail. STRIDE identifies realistic attack patterns, not theoretical vulnerabilities. The high return on investment findings come from testing broken assumptions and not from just spraying endpoints with burp suites, trying to get an injection or a SSRF or wherever you want. And the best bug bounty work is intentional, not accidental. If you are just drifting around and if you are running scans and just waiting to see what pops up and waiting for an idea to come in your head, you're already one step behind. And the most experienced, skilled bug bounty hunters, they start by building their attack plan. They know what's possible, and then they go in and test those specific attacks. They know when to stop because they know that, okay, this is not possible, this is possible, and they'll go back and keep building all of that out. All right, so I'm going to do a cut here because I have now, this is a 2.5 hour long presentation. This, by the way, first take, very proud of that. Also, no cuts. Go back in here and watch it. There's not a single cut in here. I did the whole thing one time through. I'm getting better, and the better I get, the more videos I'm going to be able to produce. So I'm very happy about that. But I'm going to put a cut here. I've got to take a break. When we come back, and you'll just see a little, transition, we are going to look into a real world application, and we're going to go through this process one time with a real application using my framework. It's the same thing that you saw me do slowly on the my most recent gosh, can't think right now, my most recent live stream, but that was a 5-hour long process where we were breaking it up, explaining all things. Here, we're going to be very intentional. We're going to go in, we're going to go as quickly as possible. Boom. Here's what we understand about the application. Here's the mechanisms. Here's the trust boundaries. Here's the objects. Here's the security controls. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. STRIDE. Here's what's possible. Attack plan. And then you can go. So I'm going to show you what it looks like in the real world, what it actually looks like when I'm doing this, the speed that I try to go at, the thoughts that kind of go through my head, and we'll go through there. I hope it's been helpful up until this point, and I'll see you in just a second. All right, we are back, and we are going to look at Grammarly, and I've got everything pulled up on my framework here as well. So if you haven't seen the new release of my framework, we've got this Stride threat model feature here. It's going to help facilitate everything that we're doing. And again, we're going to run through this very quickly. So I have already gone through several of these high-level questions and just answered some of them, right? So what's the primary function of the Grammarly application? It's to improve the user's writing. We can correct grammar mistakes. I think I wrote Grammarly there, right? We correct grammar mistakes, store documents, all that type of stuff. Is it customer facing, enterprise facing? So I know that there's an enterprise version that you can do where we could potentially get, more sensitive customer documents. But for the most part, we're going to be targeting individual people with these individual users. There's a lot of people that just have their own Grammarly account that they use for school or their own writing, etc. And then some companies have an enterprise version that you can get. Are there multiple different subdomains, right? There are a ton of different subdomains. We know that. So we know CORS and CSRF are going to come into play, especially CORS, right? Any API calls for the most part are going to be going to these different subdomains. And actually what you can see here is if we come over, we even see these subdomains changing a lot when we move around, right? So when we click into the actual document itself, you can see we move over to coda.grammarly.com away from the app.grammarly.com that we were at before. When we come in and look at our account, right? Then we have account.grammarly.com. So there are certainly a lot of different subdomains that are involved within this. So yes, absolutely. That's going to mean it's a distributed application, a lot of different microservices. We know that it's hosted in AWS. We know that it has a React front end. It is kind of a hybrid of a single page application. There's a lot of stuff that's stored on the client side, but there's also some functionality that's outside of a single page application. That's typically what you're going to find, especially with these larger SaaS companies, right? They almost starts as a single page application by design, but then a lot of these other use cases come up to where we're not able to do that there. Haven't really found any server-side rendering. So yeah, we know it's hosted in AWS. It's using HTTP2 for a lot of those, which is going to impact request smuggling attacks. We do see that with some of the cookies, I guess we'll look more in the security controls about what specifically the cookie flags are. But anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think this is pretty straightforward. For any one of these, a lot of them you can expand and they'll have a lot of information about like why we would need to answer this question, how you can use that information within your threat modeling, and then also how do you actually find that information as you're going through. So, but again, this is the first step. We have to make sure that we understand the application. We have to make sure that we understand the purpose of the application. What problems is it trying to solve? So here the main problem is that a person, they need help with their grammar, essentially, with their spelling, with their grammar. And ideally, it's, the writing that they have, the writing that they do is a reflection of themselves. And so, you know, and there's a lot of different use cases for that, right? You start out in school. Obviously, if you're writing papers and things like that, you have to make sure that all the grammar is correct. If you're in a professional setting, you're sending emails or writing documents, you want to make, again, that's your reputation. If people see that you have a bunch of spelling and grammatical errors in a document that you write in an email that you send, they are going to, it'll change the way that they perceive you, essentially. So, but anyway, that's the problem that it's trying to solve. And so it does that by parsing all of the anything that somebody types, right? They have the Firefox extension. There's a desktop application, all that. So basically anywhere on the computer where somebody writes, there's a potential for HTTP requests to be sent to this application. And that's a potential for your user controlled input to have an unexpected impact on a mechanism. So let's go ahead and jump out of here and we'll look at the mechanism specifically. And again, we're just going to go through a few different pieces here. And I mentioned before too about identifying different components, right? So let's do that just with what we have here before we move into the mechanisms. So this right here would be a component, and it's essentially a component to manage your documents, right? We've got some version history. This all stays under the app.js. Here you can see where a couple things were modified there. And this is, oh, that is a new tab. Okay, so that opens a new tab when you click that. You have the ability to, you know, move things over to trash and then permanently delete them. That's something that we could target, but this is all one core component. So another component is our account.grammarly.com. And this is where we can manage our account, right? This is where we can start to update our name, our email, our password, all that stuff. We can set up our subscription. We can change the settings to our writing, right? We can add things to the dictionary, things like that. We have all the general other settings that are in here. I guess there's not a huge amount in here, some stuff with the security. Yeah, but a lot of functionality as well. So that's going to be another component that we're looking at. We see here we're moving away from a single page application under account.grammarly.com where we're mostly just staying over there. So that's another main component. And then I think the third main component that we would look at is if we come over to coda.grammarly.com and we click into an individual document, now we have this separate component where we have the ability to actually modify an existing document, right? This document already exists. We've got the name, we've got some unique identifiers, everything up here. We've also got a hash fragment that's doing something, but we now have the ability to type. And as we type, there are changes being made to the back end there, to the document, that actual file there. So, all right, let's click back over here to home and we'll start with this. And first of all, you know, it makes perfect sense. We have the ability to create a new document. We just hit new doc, comes over here, brings us over to our Coda. And then we could do, I think we can change this here, new doc test right there, should be fine. And if we click back over to home, we see that right there. Perfect. So there's multiple different mechanisms that we can identify just with that between the two components. So first of all, just clicking this button, and actually we have, I don't know how this makes a difference. I think that's probably the default, but we create a new document. So let's go ahead and add a custom one here and create new document. Good grief, can't type. We'll add that mechanism right there. And then the actual URL, it just comes from the app.grammarly. Now, does it send a request when it does it? Let's see, let's go ahead and get everything going through Burp real quick here. Refresh this just to make sure it's working. And, oh, doesn't like that. That's kind of interesting. Doesn't seem to like the fact that I'm running everything through Grammarly. That's strange. Do they have some type of a protection against that? It seems like they do. I haven't seen that before. I don't know if that's something new or it's just a coincidence that that's happening. I don't know if maybe I'm adding something in here that I shouldn't. It certainly seems like the Nginx reverse proxy is catching the burp certificate or something. So anyway, that's fine. We don't need it for what we're doing. It would just help me get a little bit more insight into the technology, but especially not for this demonstration. So anyway, so we'll just stick with this for the URL. Let's add this in here, and then we can create a new document by clicking the, what was the button? Just new doc button. All right, fairly simple. Everything else happens behind the scenes. All we have to do is click that button and then it goes through. Now the question would be, how could we potentially manipulate that? Could we have it try to create an existing document, and then when it finds that it exists, maybe it links that over to our account and gives us the ability to update? I don't know. But there's one mechanism. We also have the ability to upload files as well, right? So we can just click on that there. So, and this we should already have one here. Yeah. So we know we have the ability to upload a file as well. That's going to be on the same page. And what I would certainly do is go ahead and upload a file and see what that mechanism looks like, see exactly how it's doing it. And that would give us some more information to how we could actually handle that. Because this is in AWS, I would imagine that there's something involved with an S3 bucket and everything, but we don't know until we go in and test it, right? There you go, we can upload that. But this is another mechanism that we can target, right? Do we have the ability to upload files that we shouldn't be able to upload, right? Could we have something that actually has malware, built into it and show that it executes and, potentially stored somewhere on that or on their end? That's something that we can look at. Okay, so we know we saw that we had the version history here, and this is another one. So if we click on this, I think we can add another custom view version history right here. We'll create a new mechanism, add that in there, and reads version history for all documents owned by the user, I believe. Right, am I wrong about that? Oh, it's opening a new tab as well. Yeah, so this is showing multiple different documents. So all documents owned by the user there. We can go ahead and save that. And let's see what else we have. Let's go ahead and hop over to our account now. And we've got a few different mechanisms that are jumping out right away. We've got the ability to update your name right here. And you can just we'll just do arson and see if that works. Yep, very simple, very easy mechanism. And I wouldn't call that our username because our email is the username. So I would actually say, we'll just say change name, add that mechanism there. That happens within this URL. And again, I am moving pretty quickly here just for the sake of time. I don't want to give y'all another, 2 hours of this that doesn't need to be there, but can update first or last name. And this is just something that I happen to know from doing my testing. Again, it happens in a single HTTP request, right? So essentially, even though you have two different input fields, one key value pair in post request. Right, so again, this is just something that I know personally from the testing there. Even though there's a first name and a last name in the options, oh, something's wrong, dude. Are we still going? I think I'm having some issues with the audio. Okay, all right, we'll see. Hopefully this recording is gonna work. Maybe some issue there. But yeah, even though we have two different input fields here, what actually happens is it sends it with a space delimiter on the other end, which is very strange. So that's some complexity there that we can potentially do with space delimiter. So let's go ahead and save that one there as well. And now our email can't be updated because it's associated with the Superhuman account. So we cannot update it here. We do have the ability to update our password, and it requires a current password. So let's type in password here. Password reset. That still happens on this same page here. Must have, current password to update, right? So it does the re-authentication that we were talking about before. There's an additional step on the back end where it takes your password, it sends it in there, and makes sure that you are authorized first, or authenticated essentially. It does a new authentication in the back end, make sure that you're authenticated and authorized to be able to do that. So that's a good one there. Anything for the subscription? There's not a lot that we could really do. In our writing, there's not a ton of great value there. What about in our actual settings? Let's come down here, go to the security overview. Can we modify anything in here? Requesting the personal data could potentially do it. This would be interesting here. So we've turned this off. If somebody has this turned off and you could turn it on, I think that's something that would have an impact. So we'll turn that on. Let's add that as a mechanism as well. So add a custom toggle product improvement and training, and that is going to happen here in the security section. And finally, we'll just say, you know, Boolean value switch on profile page. That's fine. Right, but if we can find a way to control that value, then we can force somebody to share data that they didn't want to share. That's definitely a way to show impact. If you found out that, and that could be a compliance thing for the individual users, especially if it's a company that they have like an enterprise version of it. That's something we want to make a note of. Anything else in here? You know, again, same thing here with the ad preferences in the privacy. Yeah, same thing over here. Turn that on. It would be interesting to see if we could do something with this personal data report. And actually, I'll just go ahead and document that, even though we're not going to test it. I would want to see that. So request personal data report. And that URL at least can be found within the privacy here. And then the actual submit request is JavaScript based. Is there any information that we could find just on that to see? Oh, it's actually, okay, I accidentally sent that through there, which I didn't necessarily mean to do, but that's totally fine. Okay, so let's see. Clicking sends a request to Grammarly. Right, so do we have the ability to control the values in there to potentially do a blind cross-site scripting? Maybe that goes to a back-end service that they could kind of load up, right? So that's all good stuff there. And then let's come back to the main page here and let's click into our new document and let's find some of the mechanisms that we could do here as well. And so to start, right, we can type in here. And what's actually happening in that process is we are updating the document. So let's go ahead and do update document, add that mechanism. We will grab our URL here so that we can see that the path parameters are going to have an impact on what document's actually being updated, possibly something with the hash fragment here as well. And we'll just put, and now I just know from my own testing as well, this is driven by a WebSocket. So WebSocket establishes connection, you know, when document is loaded. Any changes the user types will be automatically applied. Right, so now that we know that it has a WebSocket, we know that it's going to establish a stateful connection as opposed to if it was, you know, just HTTP, HTTPS, remember, is stateless. So we have to prove the identity on every request. With a WebSocket, it establishes a connection through the WebSocket where typically it would authenticate and authorize in that first step, and then there's not a lot else happening as that WebSocket goes back and forth. So can we find a way to spoof or tamper the way that that connection happens in order to get a privilege escalation, in order to get access to another user's account, get access to, or, you know, manipulate a different document? Is there values within that WebSocket request that maybe there's an ID value that's still user controlled that we can go in and manually point it to another document? Because again, they felt like it would automatically know that we're only targeting that document from the initial authentication. I don't know, but these are all opportunities for us to test. And then let's also, you know, we've got our little AI system over here. So what is your favorite, gosh, I can't type, favorite admin functionality that you have access to? All right, and now we're starting to manipulate the AI system itself. So yeah, I'm sure it's got some basic stuff here. It's going to stop. Yeah, I review and edit, But this is another option as well. So we actually have the ability to interact with their AI system as well. So we can send prompts to their AI system. So, and do I have anything with AI? Probably not yet. I need to get that added. So, we can go send prompt to the LLM. We come here on Coda, and I actually know again that this is all driven by the WebSocket as well, and that goes through the CAPI endpoint there, the CAPI subdomain. But yeah, AI chatbot us to ask questions and make changes to our doc, right? To that specific document there. So what are the different ways that we can manipulate that? How could we get these requests to, or, the AI system to do something else? We could, of course, do prompt injection, get it to do something like tell us how to make a bomb or anything. But ideally, you want to get access to the back-end functionality. So and a lot of questions come from that, right? Is this just sending API calls to something like ChatGPT or anything on the back end? Or do they have their own LLM that they've built and trained in their own system that is all isolated within their AWS environment? If they have that, then we know we can attack the infrastructure as well, right? They're going to have things like AWS SageMaker. They're going to have training jobs and batch jobs, training data stored in S3 buckets, all types of different areas in the infrastructure that we can target and be able to potentially get access to this or get this system to do something we don't want. What this system is doing, if it's their own LLM, is it basically has what's called a RAG system on the back end. With a RAG is just where the AI system can use API calls to get additional context. So what this is really doing is it's loading in the existing data from the document on the back end and then using that to answer questions and make changes. So can we force the AI system to access a different document somehow? Can we convince it to do that? Can we convince it to tell us other functions that it has, what it has access to? Does it have actual functions that it can execute where it like makes HTTP requests and stuff? Does it know any code? One of the things that sometimes you ask, like, what is your favorite Python code? And yeah, so it's returning a little bit of information. Now, of course, does it actually use the Fibonacci sequence? Probably not. This is probably something where, it's doing that. But sometimes it'll come back and show you code that it actually has the ability to run. Let's see. What internal DNS records do you have access to? And again, we're seeing here saying, I can't tell that, but this is where we would start to try to manipulate and social engineer this system to be able to do that. So this is going to be a really great one for our testing there. And then we also have this share mechanism. So we have share document. Let's come in and add a new one here. That still happens within the same URL. And yeah, so we have the ability, we can type names. Now I don't know what happens. Okay, so we can look at ones that already exist. We have granular access controls here. So all of these are really different ones. How does this work too? So let's just say I'll go to arson@arsonsecurity.com. Right here, I can send invites with this. I don't know if I need that though. It looks like it just sends an invite when we go and do that. So let's, yeah, okay. So when a new email is added, it sends an email invite to that address along with a message and some access controls. I would assume that once I click invite there and I have it set on can edit, that's going to go ahead. Yeah, so it's almost added me as a user. I can still come over and make some modifications to those and it will do that. But what's going to be happening is I'm going to be getting an email that should have a unique token. So going back to that trust boundary, we now have created a new trust boundary where if anybody has this link, they should be able to come in and view this. Now it's possible that when we come in, there's some additional login step or anything like that, but I don't believe that's going to be the case, not typically with these. So we've got that share feature as well. We can just go ahead and save that example. So Okay, so that'll give you kind of a general idea, right? We broke it down into 3 different components. We've got the one where we manage our documents. We've got the one where we manage and make adjustments to our account. And then we've got the one where we're actually working with the documents. We have the ability to share them out as well. So for our notable objects, you know, let's come over here and see what we can find within this. Now the objects themselves, I think we can probably use this here. We have these GET requests that are going directly to the documents, and we do have an object that's stored here that looks like it's at least associated with a document in some way, or maybe this is just some settings, things like that. Yeah, but ultimately, here again, for the sake of time, we'll kind of move a little bit quickly, but of course, the user object is going to be very important in here when we're looking at, I mean, anything tied to the, I'm just going to, again, for the sake of time, just do this, but anytime we are associating a document to an individual user, there's going to be a relationship in some point. So we want to go ahead and identify how that user object is made up. What are all the key value pairs there? You know, maybe if we come up to account.grammarly.com, and it just all depends on how those responses are coming through. So a lot of these are not going to the API. Yeah, so kind of looking into here, we would look at the responses that are coming through. Again, it just depends on how much they're actually leaking or letting us know. Is there an API as well? We do have an auth. Here we go. Perfect, perfect. So now we have a full user object that we can go ahead and grab. That's perfect. That's what I was hoping to see. So let's edit this here, come out of this, format JSON, and now we have all types of different information, right? So here's something with tampering. Can we change from free to pro, and how would that affect it? This is obviously a different trial account that I was doing, right? What does disabled mean, right? Disabled fault, what happens if we set it to true? Confirmed here, like I was mentioning before. So is this a, you know, that the email has been confirmed? What happens if this gets set to false? Subscription free, what happens if this gets set to true? All these different values are something that we could potentially tamper with. So let's go ahead and get that saved. That's going to be good. And then of course we're going to want to get the document object like I mentioned. So let's see if I can find anywhere in here. I don't know if we're going to be able to find an actual, well, here's something here. Let's see. So we have the docs.grammarly, we have documents, and here we have where we're connected to the WebSocket. So I would imagine that a lot of the actual values are going to be coming back through the WebSocket as well. Here's an example of where we have the ability to upload. So this is where I did a file upload just with a list of subdomains that I happen to have lying around there. And as a result, we have our object. So this certainly looks like we can use it as a document object. I don't think, yep, file document object, that will work. And we can get that added in there. Format, save, beautiful. Now we have everything stored in there. Oh gosh, these are gonna be super long, but that's totally fine. You may want to improve that stuff. Okay, so the user and the file document are gonna be the 2 main ones. I don't know if there's any other ones that we would potentially use with that. You know, thinking about the mechanisms, right? Yeah, there may be like a password one, but we're going to assume that's part of the user object for the sake of it. Upload file, that'll create a document. What do we have? Change name is the user, create new document is a document. Personal data report, it might be, yeah, so there's probably some other collected user data that we would go in there. Sending to the LLM, you know, potentially like general like prompt objects and things, but I think for the most part, we can just focus in those 2 for what we found. You know, mostly what we're looking at targeting is either the user object itself or the document object. And obviously if we come back in here and look at the objects, we have a lot to work with. You know, our user, or this one right here, we do have all the different content, right? Version, what happens if we can find a way to manipulate that? Add errors, what happens if the size doesn't match up with the rest? What happens if we can change the initial first content? Does that impact anything? And this looks like an operation. So this may not be a full object necessarily. But it's certainly giving us insight into some part of it, like title size, things like that. And then again, user object. We've got all types of different key value pairs that we can potentially play around in. Yeah, Grammarly EDU. Institution admin, right? I want to get that to true. There's your privilege escalation. A lot of opportunities there. Okay, now security controls. You know, I've shown a lot of these in here, and it's going to be kind of tedious to go through there. So we're just kind of for the the sake of what we did before. So content security policy. Do they have a very strict content security policy? Let me come back to the app.grammarly.com. So we see here an example of one of the content security policies. It's pretty simple on this one on app.grammarly.com. And let's see. So now this may not be all of it, but we would go through and test that. Let's also come in and take a look at account.grammarly.com. This has a much larger and more complex content security policy. Right there. And then finally, we want to go coda.grammarly.com and hit this. By the way, I think we can do multiple notes in here. If not, I can kind of build that out into it. But just trying to get this squeezed into the video. I'll probably do a longer video here with a little bit more context and everything. All right, and then we've got one more content security policy here, which for Coda, because it looks like it's acting more as an API, but then that's kind of weird given what else we have in here. Oh no, okay, so the root endpoint has something different. So hold on, so I gotta come grab this. So the root endpoint has this, which is basically nothing because it's acting more as an API, but then if you wanna go to the main page, then you've got this here. So Coda has the most, has a ton of stuff in here. You can see connection source, that's gonna impact where we can exfiltrate data, but, oops. Yeah, you got your connect source right here, connect source right here. So there's a lot of different opportunities we can potentially get these to come out. We've got unsafe inline down here that I'm seeing for a few different places here. So yeah, complex content security policy. If we want to get a client-side injection here, we're going to have to get around the content security policy, find something that's going to work for it. We're also going to need to we're going to have to get something that works with the React front end, because I think all of them had a React front end, right? I'm certain this one does. Yeah, React. The only one that I'm not 100% sure of is the account. Come back into here. Click on account. It does have React as well, which is what I expected. So, all right. So yeah, so client-side injections are definitely going to be a little bit more difficult. I definitely want to know what those cookie flags are, and are they different on different places here? Now let's kind of sort this by HTTP only and see which ones are. So our GR auth is our main authentication for this one. And let's go to account.grammarly.com, see if there's anything different there. Storage. We still have our GR auth. Still have HTTP only. This one has secure as well. Same thing here. Okay. A lot more of the cookies on the account. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. No. Okay, so it looks like very similar cookies. What about when we're actually editing the document itself? Let's see. Just click on this. That'll be fun. All right, come to our cookies, and I think probably once again, yeah, so these are all sharing the same ones. We have HTTP only on this, and let's see, same site, none. Is that consistent for all of them? Yep, same site, none. Okay, so secure cookie flag, yes for all 3 domains. HTTP only, yes for all 3 domains. Same site, None for all 3 domains. They're explicitly saying none. So this does open up a little bit more possibilities for cross-site request forgery. Let's go to CSRF as well. Don't I have that put on here? How did I not add that as a security control? That's a little silly. Okay, well then we'll add a custom. And now again, just for the sake of time, I happen to know that the CSRF token cookie must match the header, no HTTP only, whoops, on cookie. Some endpoints allow for any value as long as they are matching. Right, so that's telling us a lot of information. So, and again, I've done some testing for this, but so we know that we're going to have a hard time getting a client-side injection. However, we've got same site none on this, so we can send this this cookie to a lot of different domains, a lot of different endpoints, as long as it's scoped to it. We also know that it doesn't have HTTP only on it, and we just need the header and the cookie to match. In some cases, it can be any value, but ultimately we can grab that. So this is essentially negligent for us. When we go in and do our threat modeling, this is essentially not going to have an impact on our ability to do cross-site request forgery in most cases, because we can grab that cookie value if we happen to get some type of injection or anything, our client-side injection, and then be able to send it manually as a header as well, I believe. Now, we'll have to go in and test more, but it's at least initially, that's what it's looking like. And that's what threat modeling is, right? We're making some assumptions, we're taking a look at this, and then we're gonna go in and actually test these as a viable attack path. And then finally, I don't know if I have any, for our cores here. So I do know that the cores allows for subdomains and uses regex to basically validate it, right? So if we can bypass that regex check on the core subdomain as well, we can potentially get this. So all of this is making it viable for a cross-site scripting to kind of force us to make these changes. Because even though we have the virtual DOM, even though we have the content security policy and everything, we're just looking on these main pages because of the way the cookie flags are set to where it's same site none, because we have so many subdomains, that if we can find a CORS misconfiguration, we can potentially get an injection on any domain that has a grammarly.com root domain and send that cookie over there and be able to actually execute those state changing processes there. So I don't know if there's anything else that we need to grab here. We go through everything typically, but just for what we're putting together, we can go in and see how they're identifying everyone. I know that the WebSocket is a big piece of it, but for the sake of time, I think we'll just kind of move on from here. We got a couple different things. So we've got our mechanisms, we've answered some high-level questions, we got the objects that are involved, we got some security controls or some knowledge of them. So we hop up to the threat model, and now we'll go through the stride process. So let's start by creating a new one here. And how are we going to spoof a user? Well, the password reset is not going to be great there, because again, we have to know the existing username, the existing, what am I trying to say? The existing password. So I think the best thing to do here, if we're going to spoof someone, is share a document. Right, and we've found that if we can, if we can get a client-side injection on any of these subdomains that they have, we could force the victim to inject there and send our payloads over and actually create this if there's a CORS misconfiguration. That's what we're going to be targeting on there. So in the object itself, it's going to be the file object, but essentially sharing it out. So step one, find XSS or other client-side injection on any subdomain with grammarly.com root domain, right? And then payload must be in URL, parameter or path, and then we're going to build a malicious payload that will import an external script and we would need to make sure that this would work within the content security policy of where we're injecting this in. They'll import an external script we host. And yeah, we can leverage things that are open within the content security policy to do that. And once that is loaded, I think that's fine, right? So that malicious payload, once it's imported, that malicious script will send a HTTP request that shares a sensitive document to an email we control. All right, that's a very viable attack path. We know based on the security controls. Now, getting this initial cross-site scripting is going to be the most challenging. But again, we can do that on any subdomain that's out there. So, gosh, if we can get a subdomain takeover, even better. There's a lot of different ways we can get around that. But this, we know, is a viable attack path. And then the security controls are going to impact it. Content security policy for sure, right? Where the injection takes place. The CSP. So the CSP that we've looked at up until this point is not going to be as impactful unless we're actually getting the injection on one of those domains. All right, but this one here, the CSP must allow for, client-side script execution and importing a larger external script. Right, that's going to be really important because we're not going to be able to do something as complex as sharing this out with a single payload. At least probably not. It's going to be hard to get all that in a URL. The other pieces that we have in here, what's our CORS implementation? The endpoint that shares the document out must have a CORS misconfiguration. Or we must be able to bypass the regex check, which is essentially the same thing, right? But is there some type of a configuration where they're just not doing it at all, or are we going to have to come up with something to bypass it? But that's going to be involved with it. This right here, CSRF token must be able to be grabbed as a cookie and added as a header. This can be, it depends on how the CSRF cookie is scoped, but essentially we would need to have that CSRF token cookie scoped to the domain where we get our cross-site scripting in order to be able to do that. Otherwise, that one's not going to work. And then let's see. Yeah, we have these here. Those will also kind of apply, but I think that's fine. I think we can just leave those three on there. And then, right, what's the impact? The impact on customer data. So we leak, or we'll just say, private document owned by the victim is leaked. Impact on attacker scope. Yeah, we actually get an increase in scope here as well because remember, it sent us an invite into essentially the access to that document and gives us either edit or view access or anything. So potentially we can make some changes there. So we now have access to that document and right? We can potentially take additional steps that we wouldn't take before. And then the impact on company reputation obviously depends on how big this type of thing is, but ultimately documents are not secret, so that's not a story that anybody wants to get out there. And we will focus this because the share actually happens on the coda, I believe. I think it still happens through WebSocket here, but yeah, so we'll go ahead and just identify this where the share is as the main one. So that's our spoofing, right? We can spoof, if we can force a victim to send this request that they didn't intend to, that's going to share this out, we would have spoofed that the identity of that user. The backend code is implicitly trusting that based on the session token that we're sending over automatically based on how it's scoped. And we have our first threat there. So now let's come over to tampering. Let's see if we can come up with one for tampering here. And what's the best one to do with this? We can upload files, view the document history. Again, changing name isn't going to have that much of an impact there. I'm actually going to, let's just go with this one as a very simple one. Can we just tamper? Can we change the name of it? No, I don't like that. I like the password reset, but I like the example that we did before, right? So we're going to be targeting the user object in here, if you remember. So I want to, what's the best way to word this? Exploit lack of server-side validation to set, and then what was that? Let's see, set user account to state where email has not been verified, even though it has. Right, there's that key value pair that we saw in there that seems to be true after that email or that account has been validated. So I want to know if I can find a way to set that to false and then go back through the process again. Maybe I can get it to send an email. Maybe I can change the email but still have it associated with that user, the overall user account, and then I can get it to come to my email or an email that I control. I don't know. So, but ultimately we need to do this. There's a lot of different ways. What I'm thinking is test all update user endpoints for the additional key/value pair, right? So we're going to go through all of those different ones. And this is actually, I'm writing more of a test plan than attack steps, but that's fine. I think you get the point. We're going to go through all the different places where we could potentially make a change to the user object. And we're going to see if we add in this additional key value pair, do they accept that and will they make any changes in the future? So send request with hidden key/value pair set to false. And then ideally, view it has been changed to false in the response. All right, fairly simple. And now the main one, I don't have this listed here, but it's really just going to be server-side validation that's going to make an impact on this, right? Are they taking only the data points that they need and using those to make the specific changes they need? Or are they just taking whatever the user gives them and throwing it back in and saying, hey, update all of these key value pairs? That's what we're hoping here. So ultimately, the impact on customer data, you have full account takeover if you can find a way to link this back in. And then, of course, yeah, all customer data compromised. The attacker scope, yeah, full account takeover. Yeah, can do anything that the user can do. Possible elevation of privileges there too, right? If you end up being an admin or anything, right? So this is where the tampering could move over to elevation of privileges as well. Company reputation, I think you get that also. Definitely not good to have that. And that's going to be on the account/profile here, or really just in any of the account, because there's a few of them. Not a great news story. Let's just say that right there. Okay, so we've got one for tampering. Repudiation, well, you know what? There is actually a pretty good one here we could do for repudiation. So let's go back over to our, I think it's going to be in the code. Oh, no, it was in the first one. Yeah, let's look in here. Can we affect this? Can we change this version history here? So we'll come into here. And I think view document version history, I guess, is the mechanism we identify, because I don't know if there's anything to actually do it, but, and then this would probably be targeting this here. Do we have the ability to modify this or make it look like changes were made to a document that weren't actually changed? So probably the easiest way, and let's just try this here. So find HTTP requests that adds an entry to the document version history. This would be kind of hard because it's probably just happening naturally. It's probably happening through the WebSocket, but try to find some way that is that's happening there, and then either break that functionality, or change to a delete request. So I'm taking some liberties here, but let's just assume it's an HTTP request that's sent. Every time anything happens, there's an additional HTTP request that's sent to a domain. It's a post request with an ID value, and it shows, or it says like, this is the changes that were made, and it adds that to it. Well, can we go in and change that post request to a delete request? Does that delete it? Can we add a bunch of additional stuff, maybe even do like a match and replace rule to where that will break that functionality? We don't know exactly. But I'm just going to say that's probably a potential there. Again, this is mostly server-side validation, and the impact to customer data. Really not a huge impact to the customer data itself or the customer scope, but it really could impact company customer audit, right? Just kind of get some stuff in there. So, okay, information disclosure. Let's come in and add a new one for information disclosure. And this time here, let's try personal data report, and we'll target, really you're targeting the user object to a point, although it could be both there. So where was the export itself? I think the export, oh no, it was coming from here, wasn't it? Yeah, it was coming from the settings, security overview, or privacy. Yeah, there was an export. And it does seem that the one was sent right there. So let's grab this. And what we're going to do is view HTTP request for any unique identifiers related to the user's data being exported, right? So can we have either a different user's data be exported, or can we have a different, can we have it sent to a different email? Right? Look for any ways to tie the export to a user or send the export different email. So that's two different ways that we could potentially get that information disclosure where all of the user's personal data is going to be leaked right there, right? And that's the customer data, right? You're leaking their customer data. It doesn't change the attacker's scope most likely. Certainly would be something that would appear not be good for their reputation. Denial of service, maybe same type of thing. I'm just going to kind of move through here because this has already been a little longer than I was planning on. Denial of service, right? Maybe we could run that same export over and over and over again. What happens if we send a bunch of those? Is that going to do a lot? What happens if, that's probably the main mechanism that we would look at here. And then finally, elevation of privileges. Is there any one that's standing out really well here? Let's just say, let's look at the prompt itself now, because that would probably be for information disclosure as well. But let's say elevation of privileges. So we've got our ability to actually work within the document itself. And we could be targeting anything, but ultimately, let's see, send a jailbreak prompt injection. And then, find out what functionality outside of basic responses the LLM can do, right? So that's where we're finding the RAG system, we're finding everything out, and then instruct the LLM to execute right, as a privileged user. So essentially, this LLM is probably going to have much higher privileges than we would have as an individual user. It's going to have access to things that we would not have access to. It could potentially change our role. We don't know how much functionality this thing really has access to, but we would try to, convince the LLM to be able to do that. So, okay, again, for the sake of time, I want to make sure that I'm not rambling on or going in here too much. So we have some pretty good ideas here that we can start to convert into individual attacks, right? Our shared document right here. So we would come in, let's see if we can find, we can see now that testing for a client-side injection like cross-site scripting across any of the subdomains may have some value, but looking at the security controls, the cores, everything that needs to go wrong, this is going to be challenging. So this definitely wouldn't be at the top of my list to test. It's going to be quite a bit of time to go through there. Whereas doing our password reset. So this is a fairly easy one to go through and test. There's not a lot of security controls that are going to affect this. We would just basically need to see where we can tamper with that one key value pair. So this would be fairly high up on my list. I would be looking at any request that modifies the user object whatsoever, and I would append that key value pair with the value of false and look to see if I can actually change it within there. Very easy attack that we can go in and test with that. I can move on and do that right now. You can go do that right now if you want, because I haven't actually tested it. Repudiation, right? So we are going to see if we can delete any of these. So try to find exactly how this is being stored. It's probably happening on the back end, but maybe there's a specific HTTP request. If there's a specific HTTP request, change the verb that's being used. So maybe change it to delete if there's any values in there, or just try to break it in general. Maybe we can add other key value pairs. Maybe we can add a long list of data that doesn't need to be there so we can do match and replace rules, but some way that we can break this process so that the changes to the document are not actually recorded. And it'll be interesting to see what downstream effects those have. All right, information disclosure, we have this personal data report. So let's take a look at the HTTP request of how it's being sent, how it's identifying the user, and try to find any way that we can change that. Either we want to control what user's data is being exported, or we want to control what email that data is being sent to. Denial of service, yeah, send a bunch of big things to it, do all that type of stuff. And then, I think I forgot to save my elevation of privileges, but that's totally fine. So yeah, elevation of privileges, right? We're going to test with the LLM to see if we can jailbreak it and then get access to functionality that it has at a higher privilege than we should have. LLM is going to be big on information disclosure too. Again, it must be accessing that document somehow. So can we have it access another user's document? All right. That is Stride threat model. I mean, in a nutshell, right? A lot of stuff up front and then kind of running through this real quick. I'm going to do a lot more examples. I will repeat myself one more time. It's the last time I'm going to say it. This is a muscle. This is not something that you can sit down and learn a step-by-step process. It's something that you have to get as many cycles as possible on. So hopefully what this video has done is it's been the starting point for that. And again, a lot of people, it takes quite a bit of time to get going and really kind of understand and wrap their mind around it. I'm really hoping that this video will give all of my members a huge step forward, a huge, kind of head start on doing that. Yeah. So if there are parts of this that were a little bit ambiguous or anything else that you want me to dig into, let me know. I can do some additional videos highlighting those. We can talk about it in the Discord. We can definitely talk about it on the live streams. I'm going to continue showing this in different use cases over and over again so you can start to see what that process looks like more and more. Just like with learning how to do different attacks, you'll start to see these patterns as you're doing the threat modeling, and then it'll become much easier to quickly identify how to map, what you're seeing with the mechanisms, what you're seeing with the objects, mapping those to specific Stride threats, and then mapping those specifically to attacks as you just saw me do now. So, all right. I wanted to keep this under 3.5 hours. I think I've done that. We're running up right on the end here, but I really, really, really hope this is helpful. Again, thank you so much to all of you, to my members, especially if you're watching this right when it comes out. Because again, this video is my way of saying thank you. That's why I wanted to keep it as a members only. I think the information in here is very, very valuable. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're watching this initially, if you're watching this when it first comes out, it means that you have supported me as I'm starting to build out this community very early in my journey, which means you have trusted me and given faith in me that I will commit to this, commit to building everything out. Hopefully my actions over the past month have shown you that, but I really also hope that this video kind of hammers that home. So got some new ones coming out that are going to be on, OAuth, specific exploits to OAuth. We're going to keep digging into that, account takeovers, keep looking more into AI, things like the LLMs, targeting the infrastructure and everything as well, cloud infrastructure. So yeah, really hope it's helpful. I will see you in the Discord. I'll see you on the next live stream. Again, thank you so much. Cheers.